Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Welcome, wanderer of the Commonwealth, to the story of Preston Garvey, the last minute man, and perhaps the most sincere soul the wasteland has ever known. Tonight, we trace the complete arc of a man who believed in heroes when the world had forgotten what heroism meant, who held faith when faith became a weapon turned against him, who found hope in ashes and carried it forward even when hope felt like the heaviest burden of all. This is a tale of unwavering idealism meeting brutal reality, of a heart too honest for the world it inhabited, of redemption found not in victory, but in the simple choice to keep trying when giving up would have been so much easier. So settle in, make yourself comfortable, and let your mind drift as we walk beside Preston through every chapter of his extraordinary journey. We'll stand with him as a boy watching salvation arrive at a minute's notice, fight beside him through years of service and betrayal, witness his descent into the depths of despair, and follow his resurrection into legend. There's no need to remember every detail. Just let the story wash over you like the cool evening air settling over Commonwealth ruins, steady and inevitable, and somehow comforting in its constancy. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let's begin with a child who learned to believe in goodness because he saw it arrive when all seemed lost. The boy who would become Preston Garvey was born into a world that offered children no illusions about safety or comfort, where childhood meant learning to recognize the sound of different guns before you learned to read, where the lullabies mothers sang were warnings about staying close to home when darkness fell. He entered the world in the year 2066, some 11 years after atomic fire had rewritten the rules of existence. In a small farming settlement, somewhere in the Commonwealth, whose name has been lost to time and tragedy, like so many other pre-war designations that ceased to matter when survival became the only name worth knowing. The Commonwealth that shaped young Preston's understanding of reality was a patchwork of desperate communities scattered across the ruins of what had once been Massachusetts. Each settlement, an island of fragile civilization, surrounded by an ocean of chaos that constantly threatened to sweep in and drown them all. These were not towns in any sense that pre-war Americans would have recognized, but rather clusters of salvaged structures and improvised fortifications, places where a dozen families might huddle together behind walls made of rusted cars and corrugated metal, hoping that tonight the raiders would choose a different target, that tonight the super mutants would hunt in a different direction, that tonight would simply end without screams echoing across the darkness. Preston's earliest memories were of fear so constant it became a kind of background noise, the way city children before the war might have grown accustomed to traffic sounds or the hum of electricity through power lines. He remembered his mother's hands, rough and scarred from farm work and defense, checking the crude locks on their door every evening as the sun descended and the Commonwealth transformed from merely dangerous to absolutely lethal. He remembered his father teaching him to hide at the first sign of strangers approaching, to remain absolutely silent no matter what sounds he heard from outside, to understand that survival often meant becoming invisible until the danger passed. The settlement where Preston spent his early years survived through a combination of brutal practicality and desperate cooperation that would have seemed impossible to those who remembered civilization as something more than a fever dream. Every adult carried weapons even when working in the fields, because Tartos and mutfruit were worth killing for in a world where starvation was always just one bad season away. Children learned to shoot before they reached double digits in age, because children who couldn't defend themselves didn't survive long enough to become teenagers. The elderly and infirm were valued not despite their inability to contribute physical labor, but because they remembered things. knowledge from before the war about medicine and engineering and agriculture that meant the difference between survival and extinction. But even cooperation and constant vigilance couldn't guarantee safety in a world where organized violence was always better armed and better coordinated than scattered settlements trying to defend themselves. Preston was perhaps 8 years old, still young enough to believe that his father's presence meant absolute protection. When the raiders came in force to his settlement during harvest season, drawn by the sight of crops ready for gathering and the knowledge that the settlement would have stockpiled supplies for the coming winter. The attack came at dawn, which was tactically sound since dawn meant farmers would be tired from the previous day's labor and not yet fully alert for the new day's dangers. Preston remembered being jolted awake by gunfire and his mother's hands grabbing him, remembered the acrid smell of smoke and the screams of neighbors being cut down as they ran for defensive positions that they would never reach. His father shoved him and his mother toward the root cellar, the reinforced hiding place that every settlement maintained for exactly this kind of emergency, and Preston remembered his father's face in that moment, the terrible knowledge in his eyes that he was probably seeing his family for the last time. The root cellar was dark and cramped and filled with other families who had made it to shelter before the raiders overran the settlement's defenses. Preston huddled against his mother in that darkness, listening to the sounds of his world being destroyed above his head. The gunfire seemed to go on forever, punctuated by screams and the crash of structures being torn apart by people looking for hidden supplies and hidden survivors. He heard raiders laughing as they worked, treating the destruction of everything his community had built as entertainment rather than atrocity. And in that darkness, Preston learned a lesson that would shape everything he became, that there existed in the world people who chose to destroy rather than build, who found joy in others' suffering, who had abandoned whatever made them human in favor of becoming predators who lived by consuming what others created. The silence that eventually fell was somehow worse than the noise had been, because silence meant the raiders had finished their work and departed, and now it was time to emerge and count the cost of survival. Preston's father was not among those who had survived the attack. His body was found near the settlement's main gate, surrounded by spent shell casings that indicated he had sold his life as expensively as possible, buying time for others to reach shelter with every bullet he fired. Preston stood over that body, too young to fully process the magnitude of his loss, old enough to understand that this was what the world did to good people who tried to protect those they loved. The settlement might have died that day, might have joined the countless other communities that flickered briefly in the post-war darkness before being snuffed out by violence or disease or simple bad luck. The survivors had lost too much, had too little left to sustain themselves through the approaching winter, and the knowledge that the raiders might return at any time hung over them like a death sentence, waiting for a convenient moment to be executed. Preston remembered the adults talking in low, defeated voices about scattering to other settlements, about giving up on the dream of maintaining their little piece of civilization, about surrendering to the chaos that seemed to be the Commonwealth's natural state. And then the Minutemen came. Preston was standing near the ruins of what had been the settlement's workshop when he heard the sound that would change his life forever, a sound he would carry with him through decades of joy and trauma and desperate struggle. It was the distinctive crack of laser muskets firing, a sound different from the conventional weapons that raiders preferred, a sound that meant something other than destruction was approaching. He looked toward the settlement's broken gates and saw them, a group of men and women wearing mismatched armor but carrying themselves with the discipline of trained soldiers, moving through the ruins with weapons ready and eyes scanning for threats. They had come because someone had managed to send word of the raid before communications were cut, had come because it was what Minutemen did, arriving at a minute's notice to defend Commonwealth settlements, even when defense meant arriving after the worst had already happened. They brought medical supplies for the wounded, food for those whose stores had been ransacked, and most importantly, they brought the promise that the settlement would not have to face the next attack alone. The Minutemen helped rebuild defenses, taught the survivors better tactics for coordinated defense, and left behind supplies and weapons, and most critically, the knowledge that someone in the Commonwealth still fought for regular people, without demanding payment or tribute or submission in return. Preston watched these strangers work with an intensity that bordered on worship, absorbing every detail of how they moved and spoke and approached the overwhelming task of helping a shattered community put itself back together. They were patient with the children who followed them around, asking endless questions, kind to the elderly who needed extra help with tasks that had become impossible with wounded hands or failing eyes, respectful to everyone, regardless of whether they had anything to offer in return. One of them, a woman whose name Preston never learned, but whose face he would remember until his dying day, knelt down beside him while he was watching them reinforce the settlement's walls and asked him if he wanted to help. He did help, of course, performing whatever small tasks 8-year-old hands could manage, but more than the physical labor, he absorbed the philosophy that underlay everything the Minutemen did. They talked about the Commonwealth as if it belonged to everyone who lived there, as if every settlement and every settler had equal claim to safety and dignity, regardless of how much they could contribute to their own defense. They spoke about the future as if the future was something that could be built rather than merely endured, as if the chaos and violence that seemed to define the post-war world were not inevitable conditions, but temporary problems that organized, dedicated people could actually solve. When the Minutemen finally left, promising to check on the settlement regularly and urging them to fire signal flares if raiders returned, Preston stood watching them disappear into the Commonwealth wastes, with something burning in his chest that felt like the first genuine hope he had experienced since the bombs fell before his birth. These people were heroes in the most fundamental sense of that word, not because they possessed superhuman abilities or ancient technology, but because they had chosen to fight for others when fighting for themselves would have been so much easier. They represented proof that goodness still existed in the world, that the values his father had died defending were not naive fantasies but achievable realities if enough people committed to upholding them. The years that followed saw Preston's childhood fascination with the Minutemen deepen into something approaching religious devotion, though Preston himself would never have used such language since his faith was in human capability rather than divine intervention. Every story about Minutemen defending settlements, every rumor of their victories against raiders or super mutants, every report of their arrival at a moment of desperate need reinforced his conviction that they represented the only genuine force for good in a commonwealth full of people who had given up on goodness as impractical idealism. His mother noticed his obsession and worried about it in the way mothers worry about children who develop passions for dangerous careers. But she also understood that her son needed something to believe in after watching his father die defending their home. Preston grew up strong and capable, shaped by the harsh demands of Commonwealth life into someone who could handle weapons and physical labor with equal competence, but his real growth was in his understanding of what he wanted his life to mean. He watched other young people around him become cynical and hard, their idealism ground away by constant exposure to the wasteland's casual cruelty. But Preston's idealism somehow survived and even strengthened with each passing year. He believed, with the kind of absolute certainty that only the young can maintain, that the world could be better than it was, that people could be better than circumstances forced them to be, that the Minutemen's vision of a unified Commonwealth, working together for mutual defense and prosperity, was not a fantasy, but a blueprint waiting to be realized. The decision to join the Minutemen when he turned 17 was not really a decision at all, but rather the inevitable culmination of everything Preston had become during the 9 years since he watched his father die, and then watched strangers arrive to help for no reason except that helping was the right thing to do. He announced his intention to his mother on the evening of his 17th birthday, in the same rebuilt settlement that had been saved by Minutemen intervention all those years ago, and she received the news with a mixture of pride and resignation that comes from knowing your child has chosen a dangerous but noble path. The morning Preston Garvey left his settlement to find and join the Minutemen was clear and cold, autumn air sharp with the promise of coming winter, and he carried with him everything he owned, in a pack that felt lighter than it should have, because it was filled with hope rather than mere supplies. His mother gave him his father's old rifle, maintained with care through the intervening years despite ammunition being precious, and told him to make his father proud. Preston promised he would, though he had no way of knowing then how complicated that promise would become, how the weight of trying to live up to ideals forged in childhood would nearly destroy him before giving his life meaning that transcended personal survival. He walked through Commonwealth wastes that were dangerous and unpredictable, following rumors and radio transmissions and the advice of traders who knew where Minutemen companies tended to operate, and after several days of searching, he found them. Or rather, they found him, a patrol spotting him and approaching with weapons ready until they determined he was not a threat, but rather a young man seeking to join their ranks. They questioned him about his motivations and his skills, and Preston answered with the sincerity that would become his defining characteristic, explaining that he wanted to join because he believed in what the Minutemen stood for, because he had seen them save his settlement when he was a child, because he thought that protecting people who couldn't protect themselves was the most important work anyone could do in the post-war world. The patrol leader who interviewed him was a man named Ezra Hollis, a colonel who ran his company according to what he called the old-time Minuteman way, and something in Preston's earnest answers must have resonated with Hollis because he accepted the 17-year-old recruit on the spot. Preston Garvey became a Minuteman that day, joining Hollis's company and beginning the transformation from idealistic boy into the soldier and guardian he would eventually become. He had no way of knowing that he was joining an organization already beginning to fracture from internal contradictions, that the golden age of the Minutemen was behind them rather than ahead, that his faith would be tested in ways that would break lesser spirits completely. But on that first day, wearing the Minuteman uniform for the first time and feeling the weight of the laser musket in his hands, Preston Garvey was simply happy. He had found his calling, his purpose, his place in a world that desperately needed people willing to stand between the innocent and those who would prey upon them. He was going to be a hero like the ones who had saved his settlement all those years ago. He was going to make the Commonwealth a better place. He was going to prove that idealism and goodness could survive even in a world that seemed designed to extinguish both. The boy who believed in heroes had taken his first step toward becoming one, unaware that the path ahead would lead him through faith and betrayal, through triumph and catastrophic failure, through the depths of suicidal despair, and back toward hope he never expected to feel again. Preston Garvey's story was beginning, and the Commonwealth would be forever changed by the choices this sincere, damaged, ultimately incorruptible man would make in the decades to come. Colonel Ezra Hollis was not the kind of leader who commanded through fear or personal charisma alone, though he possessed both the respect that comes from proven competence and the warmth that draws loyalty from those who serve under difficult circumstances. He was a man in his late 40s when Preston joined his company, old enough to remember the Minutemen at their strongest, and young enough to still believe that strength could be reclaimed if enough good people committed themselves to the cause. His face was weathered by years of exposure to the Commonwealth's harsh climate and harder conflicts, lined with the kind of scars that come from standing between innocent people and those who mean them harm. But his eyes retained a clarity of purpose that suggested he had never doubted the righteousness of his chosen path. Hollis ran his company according to what he called the old-time Minuteman way, by which he meant the principles that had originally animated the organization in its earliest days after the Great War, when communities first began to recognize that survival required more than individual settlements defending themselves in isolation. He believed that Minutemen should respond to every call for help regardless of politics or payment, that they should protect everyone equally without favoritism toward wealthy settlements or discrimination against poor ones, that their authority came not from imposed force but from earned trust built through years of selfless service. These were not merely abstract ideals for Hollis, but operational principles that governed every decision he made. and Preston absorbed them with the intensity of someone who had been searching his entire young life for exactly this kind of moral clarity. The training that transformed Preston from eager recruit into competent soldier was physically demanding but psychologically fulfilling in ways that made the physical hardship seem almost irrelevant. He learned to march for hours, carrying heavy equipment through terrain that varied from urban ruins to dense forest to open farmland, his body adapting to demands that would have seemed impossible during his softer childhood years. He learned to shoot with the laser musket that was the Minutemen's signature weapon, a piece of pre-war technology that had been modified and maintained through generations of use. Its distinctive capacitor charging with a high-pitched whine before releasing energy in focused beams that could drop a raider at 100 yards if the shooter remained calm and aimed true. But more important than the physical skills was the psychological training, the shaping of Preston's mind and values to align with the Minutemen's code of conduct and strategic philosophy. Hollis was a patient teacher who understood that young soldiers needed to understand why they fought, not just how. And he spent hours around campfires explaining the Minutemen's history and purpose to his recruits. He talked about the original Minutemen of pre-war America, citizen soldiers who had stood against tyranny during the Revolution, and how their post-war descendants had revived that tradition when the Commonwealth needed defenders who would answer to communities rather than to their own ambitions. He explained that Minutemen's strength came not from superior firepower or numbers, but from the trust they built with settlements, from being people who showed up when called and never demanded more in return than communities could afford to give. Preston found himself part of a family bound not by blood, but by shared commitment to ideals that transcended individual survival. Hollis's company consisted of approximately 20 men and women, ranging in age from Preston's 17 years to veterans in their 50s who had served under multiple commanders and seen the Minutemen through various cycles of strength and weakness. They came from different settlements and different backgrounds, united by their conviction that protecting others was work worth dedicating their lives to, and the bonds that formed between them were strengthened by shared dangers and shared triumphs that created the kind of loyalty that peacetime societies rarely produce. The camaraderie that developed within the company became for Preston the closest thing to family he had known since his father's death, a group of people who understood him completely because they shared his values and his willingness to risk everything for those values. They trained together until coordinated movement became instinctive, until each person could anticipate what others would do in combat situations without needing verbal communication. They ate together around campfires after long days of patrol or construction, sharing stories and jokes and complaints about sore feet and inadequate rations, the kind of mundane bonding that makes people willing to die for each other when circumstances demand it. They celebrated together when missions succeeded and grieved together when settlements they protected suffered losses despite their best efforts, and through it all, Preston felt for the first time in his life that he belonged somewhere absolutely. The first time Preston had to kill another human being came approximately 6 months after he joined Hollis's company, during what should have been a routine patrol through territory that Minutemen presence had made relatively safe. They encountered a raider gang setting up an ambush near a trade route, positioning themselves to attack the next caravan that came through with goods from settlements further south. The tactical situation was clear. The moral calculation equally so these raiders would kill innocent traders, if not stopped, would steal supplies that settlements needed for survival, would make the Commonwealth less safe for everyone who was trying to build rather than destroy. Hollis gave the order to engage, and Preston found himself firing his laser musket at another human being for the first time, watching his shot strike the raider in the chest and drop him to the ground, where he remained motionless in a way that made clear he would never rise again. The immediate aftermath was chaos as the firefight continued, other raiders returning fire while Hollis's company advanced with the disciplined coordination of trained soldiers against the desperate aggression of people. who relied on intimidation and surprise rather than tactics. The engagement lasted perhaps 5 minutes before the surviving raiders fled, leaving behind 4 dead and the ambush materials they had been setting up. Preston stood over the body of the man he had killed and felt a complexity of emotions that his 17-year-old mind struggled to process coherently. There was satisfaction that he had performed well in combat, that his training had functioned as intended when tested by actual danger, that he had protected innocent people from predation. But there was also horror at the finality of what he had done, the understanding that his actions had ended a human life, and that no amount of moral justification could change the absolute permanence of death. The man at his feet had been someone's child once, had presumably possessed dreams and fears and memories like any human being, and now he was simply gone, erased from existence by Preston's deliberate action. Hollis found Preston standing there and understood what the young man was experiencing without requiring explanation. He had seen countless new soldiers face this moment, the collision between abstract understanding of what combat meant and visceral experience of actually taking a life. And he knew that how a soldier processed this experience determined what kind of warrior they would become. He stood beside Preston and spoke quietly about necessity and responsibility, about how killing was never good, but was sometimes required to prevent greater evils, about how the weight of taking life should never become easy to bear, but also should not paralyze those who had chosen to defend others. He told Preston that good people who killed in defense of innocence carried the weight of their actions throughout their lives, that this weight was appropriate and even necessary, but that carrying it meant continuing to function rather than collapsing under guilt that served no constructive purpose. Preston absorbed Hollis's words and made a choice that would define his approach to violence throughout his career as a Minuteman. He would kill when necessary to protect others, would perform this terrible duty without hesitation when the tactical and moral situation demanded it, but he would never allow himself to become comfortable with killing, would never let it become easy or routine or something he could do without recognizing the gravity of his actions. This internal commitment kept Preston from becoming either a paralyzed idealist who could not function in combat or a callous killer who had lost connection to the humanity of those he fought. It was a middle path that required constant psychological effort, a balancing act between effective action and moral awareness, and it was possible only because Hollis had shown him that this balance could be achieved and maintained. The months that followed saw Preston participate in dozens of operations throughout the Commonwealth, each one reinforcing his commitment to the Minutemen's cause, while building his competence as a soldier and his confidence as a defender of the innocent. They responded to distress calls from settlements under attack, arriving to find raiders or super mutants or feral ghouls threatening people who lacked the weapons or training to defend themselves effectively. They helped construct and improve defensive fortifications, teaching settlers how to build walls and establish firing positions and coordinate their defense in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. They mediated disputes between settlements that might otherwise have escalated into violence, using their reputation for fairness to broker agreements that left both parties satisfied enough to maintain peace. Each successful mission felt to Preston like a brick being laid in the reconstruction of civilization, a small but significant contribution to making the Commonwealth a place where regular people could live without constant terror. He saw settlements grow more prosperous as trade routes became safer, watched communities that had been isolated by fear begin to communicate and cooperate with neighbors they had previously viewed with suspicion, witnessed the gradual emergence of something that looked almost like the organized society that his mother's generation dimly remembered from before the bombs fell. The Minutemen were making the Commonwealth better, not through imposing order from above, but through empowering communities to protect themselves and each other, and Preston felt profound satisfaction knowing that his daily labor contributed to this larger purpose. The camaraderie within Hollis's company deepened as shared experiences created bonds that transcended mere friendship. Preston found himself trusting his fellow Minutemen with his life during combat operations, knowing that they would maintain their positions and provide covering fire and advance when signaled because they had trained together until coordination became instinctive. He shared meals with them in makeshift camps after long days of patrol, listening to their stories about why they had joined the Minutemen and what kept them committed despite the constant danger and inadequate pay. He celebrated with them when missions succeeded and mourned with them when operations went wrong despite everyone's best efforts. And through all of this, Preston felt the deep contentment that comes from being part of something larger than himself, from contributing to a cause that would outlive his individual existence. Hollis himself became for Preston a father figure who filled the void left by his biological father's death all those years ago. A role model who demonstrated through daily action what it meant to be a good man in a world that punished goodness and rewarded ruthlessness. Preston watched how Hollis made decisions, balancing tactical necessity against moral principle, always choosing the option that best served the people they protected, even when other options might have been safer or more profitable for the Minutemen themselves. He observed how Hollis treated everyone with respect, regardless of their station or capabilities, how he listened to input from junior members of his company without demanding deference to rank, how he took responsibility for failures while deflecting credit for successes to those who had done the actual work. These few good years that Preston later described with such wistful brevity were in fact the happiest period of his entire life, the time when everything he believed about the world seemed to be confirmed by daily experience, and his faith in humanity's capacity for goodness appeared to be not naive idealism, but accurate assessment of what people could achieve. When properly organized around shared values, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, in ways that gave his individual existence meaning and purpose. Felt like his daily labor was genuinely helping make the Commonwealth a better place for everyone who called it home. Felt like the values his father had died defending were not tragic delusions, but achievable realities if enough people committed to upholding them. But the good years existed within a larger context that Preston, young and idealistic and focused on his own company's operations, did not fully perceive or understand. Hollis's company was one of multiple Minutemen companies operating throughout the Commonwealth under the nominal authority of General Joe Becker, who commanded from the castle and attempted to coordinate activities across a network of semi-independent units. Becker was, by all accounts, a remarkable leader, someone who possessed both military competence and political skill, someone who could inspire fierce loyalty while also navigating the complex personalities and competing interests that existed within the Minutemen's leadership structure. What Preston did not understand at the time, what he had no reason to understand given his junior position and limited perspective, was that the Minutemen's apparent strength under Becker was not the natural state of the organization, but rather the temporary result of one extraordinary individual managing to hold together an institution that contained fundamental, structural weaknesses. The Minutemen had no formal hierarchy beyond what individual commanders could establish through personal authority and earned respect, no system for resolving disputes beyond Becker's ad hoc mediation, no mechanism for ensuring that resources were distributed fairly, or that all companies maintained similar standards of conduct and commitment to the organization's ideals. Different company commanders had different philosophies about how Minutemen should operate, different ideas about what they owed to communities versus what communities owed to them, different levels of commitment to the selfless service that the organization theoretically embodied. Some commanders, like Hollis, genuinely believed in the old-time Minuteman way and ran their companies accordingly, responding to every call for help and asking nothing in return beyond what communities could afford to provide. Others were more pragmatic or more cynical, viewing the Minutemen as a way to exercise power and extract resources from settlements while maintaining a veneer of protective service that justified their authority. These philosophical differences created tensions that Becker managed to contain through force of personality and political maneuvering, through playing different factions against each other when necessary and building consensus when possible. through the sheer, exhausting labor of keeping people focused on external enemies rather than internal grievances. He maintained what appeared from outside to be a unified organization through constant attention to disputes and conflicts that threatened to fracture the Minutemen into competing factions. And his success in this regard meant that soldiers like Preston could focus on their missions without understanding how precarious the organizational unity actually was. Preston occasionally heard about disagreements between different companies, conflicts over jurisdiction or resources, or seniority that sometimes required Becker's intervention to resolve. But these seemed to him like minor administrative issues, rather than symptoms of deeper structural problems. He assumed, with the confidence of youth and inexperience, that the Minutemen were fundamentally strong and that temporary disagreements were normal features of any large organization. He had no framework for understanding that institutions can be simultaneously successful at their stated missions and deeply fragile in their internal cohesion. That what appears solid can actually depend entirely on specific individuals holding everything together through personal effort and charisma. General Becker's death in combat came without warning and without designated succession, a sudden removal of the keystone that had been holding the entire organizational arch in position. He fell during an operation against super mutants that had been threatening settlements in the Northern Commonwealth, killed by a mutant's heavy weapon fire while leading from the front in the way that had made him respected by every Minuteman under his command. The news reached Hollis's company several days after the event, carried by a messenger who also brought information about the confusion and conflict that had erupted immediately among the surviving leadership. Preston's initial reaction to Becker's death was grief at the loss of a leader he had never met personally, but had admired from afar, combined with confidence that the Minutemen would endure this setback as they had endured countless others throughout their history. He assumed that another strong leader would emerge, that the organization's institutional strength and shared commitment to common ideals would carry them through this transition period, that perhaps there would be some temporary disruption, but nothing that would fundamentally threaten the Minutemen's mission or capabilities. He was young and idealistic and had known only the good years under Becker's leadership, had no experience with institutional failure or organizational collapse, had no reason to suspect that everything he valued was about to fracture in ways that would nearly destroy him. Hollis knew better, understood from his longer experience and deeper knowledge of the Minutemen's internal dynamics that Becker's death represented a catastrophic blow to organizational cohesion, that the tensions Becker had managed to contain would now erupt into open conflict without his mediating presence. He tried to explain this to his company, tried to prepare them for the chaos that was coming, but Preston heard the words without fully comprehending their implications. How could an organization built on such strong ideals fall apart simply because one leader died? How could people who had committed themselves to protecting the Commonwealth suddenly turn on each other over petty disputes about power and resources? Preston would soon learn the answers to these questions in ways that would shatter his faith and nearly cost him his life. But for now, in these final moments of innocence before the collapse began, he remained confident that the Minutemen would endure. He had experienced only the good years, the time when everything worked as it was supposed to, when ideals seemed to produce tangible results and selfless service appeared to be its own reward. The fracturing that would follow Becker's death would teach him that ideals alone are insufficient without structures to sustain them, that good intentions cannot substitute for institutional stability, that the same people who fight heroically for others under strong leadership can turn destructively self-interested when that leadership disappears. But those lessons lay in the future, approaching with the inevitability of Commonwealth storms gathering on the horizon. For now, Preston Garvey remained a true believer in the Minutemen and everything they represented, a young soldier who had found purpose and family and meaning in service to ideals larger than himself. The good years were ending, though he did not yet know it, and everything that followed would test his faith in ways he could not have imagined, even in his darkest nightmares about what the future might hold. The fracturing began almost immediately, after General Becker's body was returned to the castle for burial, as if his death had been the only thing preventing forces of discord and self-interest from expressing themselves openly among the Minutemen leadership. What Preston had assumed would be a brief period of mourning, followed by orderly succession, revealed itself instead as the moment when carefully suppressed conflicts erupted into the open. When personal ambitions that had been restrained by Becker's authority suddenly found expression. When the fragile unity that had made the Minutemen effective dissolved into the chaos of competing factions, pursuing their own interests while claiming to represent the organization's true ideals. The first signs of trouble reached Hollis's company through radio communications that grew increasingly contentious and confused as different commanders attempted to assert authority over the broader organization without possessing either the legitimacy or the respect that Becker had accumulated through years of effective leadership. Multiple voices claimed to speak for the Minutemen as a whole, each insisting that their interpretation of the organization's mission and their approach to command structure represented the authentic vision that Becker would have wanted them to pursue. These competing claims might have been resolved through some democratic process or clear succession plan, but the Minutemen had never established such mechanisms because Becker's personal authority had made them seem unnecessary. And now, his absence revealed that the organization possessed no institutional framework for resolving fundamental disagreements about leadership and direction. Preston listened to these radio arguments with growing confusion and distress, unable to understand how people who had served together under Becker could suddenly treat each other with such hostility and suspicion. He heard commanders who had once cooperated on joint operations now accusing each other of hoarding resources, of abandoning settlements that needed help, of using Minutemen authority to extract tribute from communities rather than providing genuine protection. He heard debates about seniority devolve into personal attacks, discussions about resource allocation transform into accusations of theft and corruption. Strategic disagreements escalate into threats of violence between companies that theoretically belonged to the same organization. The philosophical foundation of Preston's worldview, built on the assumption that people committed to shared ideals would naturally cooperate to achieve common goals, began to crack under the weight of evidence that ideology alone could not overcome human nature's tendency toward factional conflict and self-interested competition. These were the heroes he had believed in since childhood, the men and women who had dedicated their lives to protecting the Commonwealth, and yet they were fighting each other with an intensity that exceeded the energy they devoted to fighting raiders or super mutants or any of the actual threats that endangered the people they had sworn to protect. Hollis tried to explain to his company what was happening, drawing on his longer experience with the Minutemen to provide context that Preston's youth and idealism had prevented him from perceiving earlier. He explained that the unity under Becker had always been more fragile than it appeared, maintained through constant political maneuvering and personal intervention rather than institutional strength. He described how different commanders had always possessed different motivations for joining the Minutemen, ranging from genuine commitment to protecting others to more selfish desires for authority and respect, and material benefits that came from being part of a powerful organization. He outlined how Becker had managed to keep these different factions working together by balancing their interests and mediating their conflicts, but that without Becker's unique combination of military competence and political skill, there was no mechanism to prevent the organization from fragmenting along the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. Preston heard these explanations but struggled to accept their implications, clinging to the belief that the ideals themselves should be sufficient to unite people, regardless of personal differences or competing interests. He wanted to believe that the Minutemen's mission of protecting the Commonwealth was important enough that anyone who genuinely cared about that mission would set aside petty disputes in favor of cooperation toward shared goals. The possibility that people could sincerely believe in protecting others while still prioritizing their own power and resources seemed like a contradiction that his young mind could not reconcile. And yet, The evidence of exactly this contradiction played out daily across the radio frequencies and through reports that reached Hollis's company about conflicts erupting throughout the Minutemen's network. The political infighting that consumed the Minutemen leadership in the months following Becker's death manifested in ways that directly harmed the organization's ability to fulfill its protective mission. Companies that had previously coordinated their operations now refused to provide mutual support. Commanders, citing jurisdictional disputes or disagreements about chain of command as justification for abandoning settlements that needed help but fell within another company's nominal territory. Resources that had been shared across the organization under Becker's coordination system were now hoarded by individual commanders who feared that distributing supplies fairly would leave their own companies vulnerable if conflicts with other Minutemen units escalated into actual violence. Preston witnessed specific incidents that transformed his abstract confusion about organizational politics into visceral horror at what the Minutemen were becoming. He was present when Hollis's company responded to a distress call from a settlement under raider attack, only to discover that another Minutemen company had been camped less than a mile away but had refused to intervene because their commander was engaged in a dispute with Hollis about seniority and resource allocation. The settlement had lost 3 people in the attack that could have been prevented if the nearby Minutemen had simply done their job, and when Hollis confronted the other commander about this failure, he received only excuses about unclear chain of command and the need to preserve resources for their own operations, rather than wasting ammunition on settlements that technically fell under Hollis's jurisdiction. Preston stood and listened to this exchange, feeling physically ill, watching 2 Minutemen commanders argue about jurisdiction and seniority, while the bodies of people they had failed to protect were being prepared for burial in the settlement behind them. These were the heroes he had believed in, the organization he had devoted his life to serving, and they were allowing innocent people to die because of petty political disputes that had nothing to do with the Minutemen's stated mission. The cognitive dissonance between what the Minutemen claimed to represent and what they actually did in practice became too large for Preston's idealistic framework to contain, and he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of how the world actually worked versus how he had believed it should work. Other incidents followed with depressing regularity as the Minutemen's reputation throughout the Commonwealth began to suffer under the weight of their internal dysfunction. Preston heard about settlements that stopped calling for Minutemen help because previous calls had gone unanswered, commanders being too busy fighting each other to respond to actual threats against the communities they claimed to protect. He learned of situations where multiple Minutemen companies had showed up to the same settlement and spent more time arguing with each other about who was in charge than actually addressing the problems that had prompted the distress. Cool. He received reports of commanders who had begun demanding payment or tribute from settlements in exchange for protection, transforming the Minutemen from selfless defenders into just another group extracting resources from vulnerable communities. Preston's role in all of this was simultaneously privileged and powerless, close enough to see what was happening, but too junior and insignificant to influence the larger forces destroying the organization from within. As a member of Hollis's company, he remained part of a unit that continued to uphold the old Minuteman way, responding to every call for help and maintaining the standards of conduct that Hollis insisted represented the authentic vision of what the Minutemen should be. But Hollis's company was increasingly isolated within the broader organization, other commanders viewing their principled stance as either naive idealism or sanctimonious judgment of those who took a more pragmatic approach to the challenges of maintaining military force in the post-war Commonwealth. The philosophical crisis that this situation created for Preston went deeper than mere disappointment at seeing heroes fail to live up to his expectations. He found himself questioning the fundamental assumptions that had shaped his entire worldview since childhood, wondering whether his belief in human goodness and the possibility of organized altruism had been based on naive misunderstanding of human nature rather than accurate assessment of what people were actually capable of achieving. If the Minutemen, an organization explicitly dedicated to protecting others, could descend so quickly into selfish infighting and abandonment of their core mission? What did that say about humanity's capacity for sustained commitment to ideals that transcended immediate self-interest? Preston spent long nights lying awake in whatever shelter or camp his patrol duties had brought him to, wrestling with questions that his 17 years of life had not prepared him to answer. Were the ideals themselves flawed, asking too much of human nature to sustain over time without the artificial support of a strong leader forcing compliance? Or were the ideals sound but the people inadequate, too weak or selfish to consistently live up to principles they claimed to believe in? The distinction mattered enormously to Preston because it determined whether his faith should be directed toward fixing the organization or abandoning it entirely, whether the problem was structural and therefore possibly solvable, or fundamental to human nature and therefore permanent. Hollis offered guidance when he noticed Preston's struggle, drawing on his own longer experience with institutional failure and personal disappointment to provide perspective that youth could not achieve independently. He explained that ideals were always vulnerable to corruption by human weakness, that the question was not whether people would fail to live up to their principles, but how quickly they recovered from those failures and what systems they built to prevent repeated collapses. He argued that the Minutemen's current crisis represented a failure of institutional design rather than proof that their core mission was impossible, that if they survived this period of chaos, they might emerge stronger by establishing structures that could maintain unity without depending on a single leader's personal authority. Preston wanted to believe Hollis's optimistic interpretation, wanted to think that the Minutemen could survive their current dysfunction and emerge reformed and strengthened by the experience of nearly destroying themselves through internal conflict. But the daily evidence of continuing deterioration made such optimism increasingly difficult to maintain, as months passed without any sign that the infighting might resolve itself peacefully. Companies that had once cooperated now avoided each other entirely when possible, and regarded each other with open hostility when contact became unavoidable. Commanders who had served together under Becker now spoke of each other in terms usually reserved for raiders or other enemies. Accusations of betrayal and corruption flying across radio frequencies that had once carried coordinated defense plans. The Commonwealth's civilian population noticed the Minutemen's decline with a speed that suggested they had always been more aware than Preston realized of the organization's internal weaknesses. Settlements that had relied on Minutemen protection began establishing their own defense forces or seeking security arrangements with other groups, no longer trusting that a distress call would bring the reliable assistance that Becker's Minutemen had provided. Traders who had once depended on Minutemen patrols to keep routes safe now traveled in larger, better-armed caravans, or avoided certain areas entirely rather than assuming protection would be available when needed. The gradual erosion of trust was almost worse than outright hostility would have been, a quiet turning away that suggested the Commonwealth's people had concluded the Minutemen were no longer relevant to their survival calculations. Preston witnessed this loss of faith from communities he had helped protect, saw the skepticism in settlers' eyes when Hollis's company arrived in response to calls for help, sensed their surprise that any Minutemen still cared enough to actually show up when summoned. The assumption had apparently spread that the Minutemen were now too busy fighting each other to concern themselves with their stated mission, and while Hollis's company consistently proved this assumption wrong through their continued responsiveness, Preston understood that individual companies maintaining standards could not restore an organizational reputation being destroyed by the majority's dysfunction. The psychological weight of watching an institution he loved decay from within while being powerless to stop or even significantly slow, that decay pressed down on Preston with increasing heaviness as months stretched into a year and then longer. He found himself caught between loyalty to the specific people he served with, his brothers and sisters in Hollis's company who continued to embody the ideals that had drawn him to the Minutemen, and growing recognition that the organization as a whole had betrayed everything it claimed to represent. The distinction between the Minutemen as an ideal and the Minutemen as an actual collection of flawed human beings pursuing their own interests became impossible to ignore, and Preston struggled to maintain faith in the former while confronting daily evidence of the latter's failures. Hollis's company itself began to feel the strain of isolation within the broader organization, as their principled refusal to participate in the political games and resource hoarding that consumed other units made them vulnerable in ways that pure military competence could not address. They continued to respond to every call for help regardless of whether doing so left their own supplies depleted or their defensive positions weakened, maintained the old Minuteman way, even when it meant operating at constant disadvantage compared to commanders who prioritized their own company's welfare over the communities they claimed to protect. This approach was noble and admirable, and exactly what Preston believed Minutemen should do, but it was also exhausting and ultimately unsustainable without the support structure that the organization's unity had once provided. Preston watched younger members of the company become disillusioned and leave, unable to maintain faith in an organization that seemed determined to destroy itself through internal conflict, while enemies continued to threaten the settlements they had sworn to protect. He saw veterans grow cynical and bitter, their idealism ground away by the daily evidence that most of their fellow Minutemen cared more about personal power than collective mission. He observed Hollis age visibly under the strain of trying to maintain standards and morale while the broader organization collapsed around them. The weight of responsibility for keeping one small group functional in the midst of institutional failure, taking a physical and psychological toll that no amount of personal strength could indefinitely resist. The mounting frustration of being powerless to arrest the Minutemen's decline, despite seeing clearly what needed to change, created in Preston a sense of helplessness that he had not experienced since his father's death. He could identify the problems, could articulate solutions, could argue passionately for unity around shared ideals and abandonment of petty political disputes. But he lacked the authority or influence to make anyone outside Hollis's company listen to his arguments. The other commanders dismissed him when he tried to speak at the increasingly rare meetings where different units still attempted to coordinate activities, viewing him as a naive young idealist who did not understand the practical necessities of maintaining military force in the post-war Commonwealth. Preston's internal conflict during this period was fundamentally about loyalty and identity, about whether he owed greater allegiance to the institution of the Minutemen or to the ideals that institution claimed to embody. If the organization had become irredeemably corrupt, was remaining part of it a betrayal of the values that had drawn him to join in the first place? But if he abandoned the Minutemen entirely, was that giving up on the possibility of reform and leaving the Commonwealth without even the limited protection that units like Hollis's company continued to provide? The decision was complicated by his emotional attachment to the specific people he served with, his brothers and sisters who had become his family and who would be abandoning if he left the organization. Hollis sensed Preston's internal struggle and spoke to him about it with the directness of someone who understood that sometimes the kindest thing a commander can do is acknowledge, rather than minimize, the genuine difficulties their soldiers face. He told Preston that he would understand if the young man chose to leave, that watching an institution you love betray its own principles was among the most painful experiences a person could endure, that no one would judge him harshly for deciding he could not continue serving an organization that had lost its way so completely. But Hollis also argued that leaving would mean the Minutemen lost one more person who genuinely believed in what they should be, that every departure of a true believer made the organization more completely captured by those who cared only about their own interests. Preston chose to stay, motivated less by hope that the Minutemen could reform themselves than by loyalty to Hollis and the others in his company, who continued fighting for ideals, even when those ideals seemed increasingly disconnected from organizational reality. He told himself that he was staying to protect the specific communities that depended on Hollis's company rather than to serve the Minutemen as an institution, that he could separate his personal commitment to helping people from his relationship with the organization that had taught him how to provide that help. This distinction helped him maintain psychological coherence in a situation that otherwise threatened to crush him under the weight of cognitive dissonance between belief and reality. But the distinction was ultimately unsustainable because the Minutemen's continued decline was creating conditions where even companies that maintained high standards could not effectively protect the communities they served. The lack of coordination between units meant that threats were addressed inefficiently or not at all. Raiders and super mutants able to operate more freely because Minutemen companies were too busy watching each other suspiciously to watch for actual enemies. The hoarding of resources meant that even disciplined units like Hollis's ran low on ammunition and medical supplies, forced to make difficult choices about which calls for help they could answer with their limited capabilities. Most devastatingly, the Minutemen's damaged reputation meant that settlements increasingly handled their own security rather than calling for help, only reaching out when situations had already become desperate enough that even effective intervention might come too late. Preston saw all of this unfolding with the clarity of someone who understood both the tactical and strategic implications of organizational dysfunction, and his powerlessness to arrest the decline, despite understanding it, perfectly created a kind of spiritual exhaustion that went beyond mere physical tiredness. He continued to perform his duties with the competence and dedication that Hollis had trained into him, continued to fight effectively when combat situations demanded it, continued to help settlements with construction and training and all the other services that Minutemen were supposed to provide. But the sense of meaning and purpose that had once animated these activities had been hollowed out by the knowledge that his individual efforts, however conscientious, could not compensate for the broader organizational failure that was leaving the Commonwealth increasingly vulnerable to forces that organized, unified Minutemen could have contained. The weight on Preston during this period was not merely the physical demands of constant patrol and frequent combat, but the psychological burden of maintaining hope and effectiveness while watching everything he believed in crumble despite his best efforts to shore it up. He was young enough that he had not yet developed the defensive cynicism that allows older people to continue functioning in failed institutions by lowering their expectations and accepting dysfunction as normal, but not quite mature enough to develop the philosophical perspective that might have helped him contextualize institutional failure as one phase in a longer cycle of growth and decline that all human organizations experience. He existed in a painful middle ground where he could clearly see what was wrong, but lacked both the power to fix it and the emotional distance to accept it. Hollis's attempts to maintain standards and morale within his company became increasingly desperate as the months passed, and the Minutemen's broader deterioration continued without any sign of bottoming out or reversing. He emphasized to his soldiers that they were keeping faith with the true Minutemen ideals, even if the organization as a whole had abandoned them, that their work mattered regardless of what other commanders chose to do, that protecting even a few communities was better than protecting none. These arguments were sound and persuasive in their way, and they succeeded in keeping the company functional when many other units had effectively dissolved into armed gangs that used Minutemen identity as a justification for extracting resources from settlements rather than protecting them. But Preston could see the toll that maintaining this principled stance was taking on Hollis, the way his mentor and father figure was being ground down by the impossible task of keeping one small group functional and idealistic in the midst of institutional collapse. The lines on Hollis's face deepened. His voice grew hoarse from constantly rallying morale and explaining why their continued effort mattered. His movements became slower and more deliberate in ways that suggested exhaustion that went beyond what sleep could cure. Preston watched his commander age visibly under the strain and felt guilty for adding to that strain through his own doubts and questions, even as he could not help but wonder whether their continued service was achieving anything meaningful or merely postponing the inevitable admission that the Minutemen were finished as an effective force for protecting the Finnish Carlins. Commonwealth. The situation might have continued in this deteriorating stasis indefinitely, with Hollis's company slowly being worn down by isolation and insufficient resources, while the broader organization completed its collapse into irrelevance. If external events had not intervened to transform the Minutemen's internal dysfunction from a source of inefficiency into a catalyst for catastrophic betrayal, the call from Quincy would arrive carrying with it the weight of everything Preston feared about what the Minutemen had become, proof that institutional failure was not merely a matter of reduced effectiveness, but could create conditions where former brothers in arms became active enemies, where the same training and knowledge that made Minutemen effective protectors could be weaponized against the very communities they had sworn to defend. But before Quincy, there were these months and years of slow decline, watching the dream he had believed in since childhood reveal itself as more fragile than he had imagined, discovering that good intentions and shared ideals were insufficient to maintain organizational unity without the structures and leadership that gave those ideals practical expression. Preston aged during this period in ways that had nothing to do with the passage of time and everything to do with the education he received about human weakness and institutional failure. Lessons that would have broken a less sincere person completely, but instead left him damaged in ways that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. The faith that had brought him to the Minutemen at 17 was not destroyed during this period, but rather complicated and deepened, transformed from naive certainty about human goodness into something more mature and tragic. An understanding that people could sincerely believe in ideals while consistently failing to embody them, that organizations built on noble principles could decay into vehicles for pursuing interests that contradicted their founding purposes. This knowledge was crushing in its implications, but also necessary for any genuine understanding of how the world actually worked. And Preston absorbed it with the intensity of someone who could not afford the luxury of comfortable illusions, because people's lives depended on his ability to operate effectively in reality as it existed rather than as he wished it to be. The fracturing of his faith was not yet complete as this period drew toward its terrible conclusion, but the cracks had spread throughout the foundation of his worldview, and when Quincy finally arrived to test what remained of that foundation, the structure would collapse entirely under the weight of betrayal more comprehensive than anything Preston had yet experienced or imagined possible. The stage was set for the day everything he believed would die, and his long descent into the darkness would begin. The call from Quincy came on a morning that began like countless others during Preston's service with Colonel Hollis's company. With the routine of breaking camp and preparing for another day of patrol through Commonwealth territory that had grown increasingly dangerous as the Minutemen's organizational collapse left more settlements vulnerable to predation, the radio transmission arrived while they were cleaning weapons and checking equipment. A desperate voice cutting through the normal static and chatter that filled the Minutemen frequencies, speaking with the particular quality of terror that comes from people who understand exactly what is about to happen to them and know they lack the capability to prevent it. Quincy was under attack by a mercenary group called the Gunners, heavily armed professionals who operated throughout the Commonwealth, taking contracts from anyone who could pay their substantial fees. And the town's leadership was calling for Minutemen assistance with the kind of desperation that suggested they understood this was their last hope for survival. The Gunners were not raiders or opportunistic bandits, but trained soldiers with military-grade equipment and tactical coordination, the kind of threat that required organized resistance from defenders who knew what they were doing. Exactly the situation that the Minutemen had been created to address when individual settlements lacked the capability to defend themselves against superior force. Hollis responded to the call immediately, as Preston had known he would, because responding to calls for help, regardless of circumstances or convenience, was the core principle that defined his approach to command and his understanding of what it meant to be a Minuteman. He gathered his company and explained the situation with the directness of someone who had long ago learned that soldiers function better when they understand what they are fighting for and what they are likely to face. Quincy was a substantial settlement, home to perhaps 200 people who had built something approaching real civilization in their corner of the Commonwealth, and its loss would represent not just a tragedy for those who lived there, but a symbolic victory for the forces of chaos that constantly threatened to overwhelm the fragile order that communities struggled to maintain. Preston helped prepare for the march to Quincy with a mixture of apprehension and grim determination, understanding that this operation would be more dangerous than the typical raider suppression or defense coordination that constituted most of their recent missions. The gunners were professionals, which meant they would not break and flee when faced with organized resistance the way raiders typically did, and their superior equipment meant that any engagement would be costly, even if Hollis's company fought perfectly. But the alternative to responding was abandoning Quincy to massacre and destruction, proving correct the growing Commonwealth belief that the Minutemen no longer actually protected anyone, and that alternative was unacceptable to both Hollis and Preston, regardless of the personal risks involved. The march to Quincy took the better part of 2 days, through territory that showed increasing signs of gunner activity, evidence of their scouting parties and forward positions, suggesting they had committed substantial resources to taking the town. Hollis sent runners ahead to alert other Minutemen companies in the region, calling for the kind of coordinated response that used to be standard procedure when substantial threats emerged, but had become increasingly rare as organizational dysfunction made cooperation between units difficult or impossible. The runners returned with promises of support from several commanders who claimed they would mobilize their companies and converge on Quincy to provide the reinforcements that would make defending the town feasible against gunner superiority in numbers and equipment. Preston allowed himself to hope during that march that perhaps the Quincy crisis would serve as the catalyst for restoring some measure of Minutemen unity, that faced with a clear external threat and an obvious need for cooperation, the commanders who had spent months fighting each other might remember their actual purpose and work together effectively. He imagined Quincy becoming a turning point where the Minutemen proved to themselves and the Commonwealth that they were still capable of fulfilling their protective mission when circumstances demanded it, that the ideals that had drawn him to the organization were still operative despite the recent years of decline and dysfunction. The reality that greeted Hollis's company when they arrived at Quincy shattered whatever optimism Preston had maintained about the operation's prospects or the Minutemen's capacity to function as a unified force. The town was already under heavy assault when they reached the outskirts, gunner forces having apparently begun their attack before the Minutemen arrival, in violation of the usual mercenary practice of offering terms before initiating hostilities. The sound of sustained gunfire echoed through the streets, accompanied by the screams of civilians and the crash of structures being destroyed by explosives or heavy weapons fire, creating an auditory landscape of chaos that suggested the defense was already failing despite whatever resistance Quincy's inhabitants were attempting to mount. Hollis made the decision to engage immediately, rather than waiting for the reinforcements that other Minutemen companies had promised. Understanding that delaying would mean arriving too late to save anyone or anything worth saving, he deployed his company with the tactical precision that years of experience had taught him, establishing firing positions that would allow them to support Quincy's defenders while minimizing exposure to gunner weapons that outranged the Minutemen's standard equipment. Preston found himself positioned on the second floor of a partially collapsed building overlooking one of the main approaches to the town center, his laser musket charged and ready, his hands steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm rational thought when he considered what they were about to attempt. The engagement began with Preston's company opening fire on gunner positions that had been suppressing Quincy's defensive line, trying to relieve enough pressure that the town's defenders could regroup and establish a coherent perimeter. For the first few minutes, the plan seemed to be working as designed, gunner forces responding to this new threat by redirecting some of their attention toward the Minutemen positions, while Quincy's defenders used the respite to improve their positions and coordinate their fire more effectively. Preston dropped 3 gunners with careful shots from his elevated position. Each successful hit a small victory that fed his desperate hope that perhaps they could actually hold, that perhaps Hollis's company could make enough difference to turn the tide, despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The revelation of Clint's betrayal came not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual, horrible recognition that the gunners were responding to Minutemen tactics with a familiarity that suggested they understood exactly how Hollis's company would position itself and maneuver under pressure. Clint had been a Minuteman, had served with distinction for years, before the organizational collapse convinced him that the group's idealism was naive fantasy, and that survival in the Commonwealth required the kind of pragmatic ruthlessness that the gunners represented. He had left the Minutemen months earlier to join the mercenaries, taking with him intimate knowledge of Minutemen training and tactics, and the personal understanding of how specific commanders like Hollis thought about combat situations. Preston did not immediately understand what it meant when gunner forces began flanking their positions using approach routes that should have been unknown to attackers unfamiliar with Minutemen defensive doctrine, or when their suppressing fire focused with unusual precision on exactly the positions where Minutemen would normally establish command and communication points. But Hollis understood, recognized the signature of someone who knew how they fought being used against them, and when he finally identified Clint among the gunner commanders coordinating the assault, the full magnitude of the betrayal became impossible to deny or rationalize. A former brother-in-arms was actively working to kill them, using knowledge gained through years of shared service to maximize casualties among people he had once fought beside, treating his former comrades as nothing more than tactical problems to be solved through application of superior force and insider knowledge. The betrayal was not merely personal, but represented everything that the Minutemen's collapse had created. The transformation of people who had once believed in protecting others into mercenaries who would kill anyone for sufficient payment. The complete abandonment of ideals in favor of survival and profit, regardless of moral cost. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly once Clint's involvement became apparent, gunner forces exploiting their knowledge of Minutemen weaknesses to systematically dismantle the defensive positions that Hollis's company had established. Preston found himself forced to abandon his elevated position when gunners flanked the building using an approach route he had not been watching, because it should have been impossible for attackers to know it offered access to his location. He retreated to ground level and regrouped with other members of his company who had been similarly dislodged from their positions, all of them recognizing that they were being outmaneuvered by an enemy who understood their capabilities too well for the engagement to be sustainable. Hollis called for the reinforcements that other Minutemen companies had promised, using radio frequencies that should have brought immediate response from commanders who had committed to supporting the Quincy operation. The responses that came back were excuses and evasions, claims that their companies were engaged with other threats or lacked the resources to commit to a prolonged engagement, or had reconsidered their ability to reach Quincy in time to make a meaningful difference. Preston listened to these radio transmissions with a sick horror that exceeded even the physical danger of his immediate combat situation. Understanding that they were being abandoned by fellow Minutemen who had promised support but had decided that political disputes and resource preservation mattered more than honoring their commitments to provide mutual aid. The realization that no help was coming, that Hollis's company would have to hold against superior gunner forces without the reinforcements that would have made defense feasible, transformed the engagement from difficult but potentially successful to a desperate last stand, where the only question was how many people could be saved before being overwhelmed. Hollis adjusted his tactics accordingly, shifting from attempting to hold defensive positions to organizing a fighting retreat that would allow civilians to escape while his Minutemen bought time with their lives. Preston found himself helping to evacuate families from their homes, while maintaining covering fire against gunner forces that pressed closer with every passing minute. Seeing the terror in children's faces as their parents hurried them toward whatever safety might exist beyond Quincy's perimeter, the battle became a nightmare of constant movement and desperate improvisation, holding positions just long enough to allow civilians to move further back before retreating to the next defendable location and repeating the process. Preston killed more people that day than in all his previous combat experience combined, his laser musket's distinctive whine and crack becoming a rhythm that matched his heartbeat as he fired and charged and fired again at gunners who kept coming regardless of casualties. He saw members of his company fall around him, people he had trained with and eaten with and considered family dropping to gunner fire and not rising again. Each loss a wound that he could not afford to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean surrendering to the grief and horror that threatened to paralyze him completely. Colonel Hollis's death came during the fighting retreat through Quincy's central market area, where the Minutemen had established a hasty defensive line to cover the withdrawal of the largest group of civilian evacuees. A gunner with a hunting rifle, positioned in elevated cover that provided clear sight lines across the market square, hit Hollis in the chest with a shot that penetrated his armor and caused damage that Preston's limited medical training recognized immediately as fatal. Hollis went down hard, his weapon falling from hands that could no longer maintain their grip, and Preston abandoned his position to reach his commander, even though doing so meant exposing himself to fire that was searching for exactly this kind of tactical mistake. Preston dragged Hollis behind cover that was inadequate but better than remaining in the open, his hands already slick with blood that was pumping from the wound, in quantities that confirmed what Preston had already known about the injury's severity. Hollis was conscious but struggling to breathe, his lungs filling with blood that he coughed up in quantities that painted his teeth and lips red. And his eyes found Preston's face, with an intensity that suggested he was using his last moments of consciousness to communicate something he considered essential before dying. The words Hollis spoke were barely audible over the sound of sustained gunfire and the screams of wounded and dying all around them. But Preston heard them with perfect clarity, because they were the last instructions his mentor would ever give him, and therefore had to be preserved with absolute fidelity, regardless of how much he wanted to reject their implications. Hollis told Preston that he was in command now, that the survivors were his responsibility, that he needed to get as many people out as possible, even if that meant abandoning Quincy entirely, because preserving lives mattered more than holding territory. He spoke about the Minutemen's ideals with his final breaths, insisting that what they represented was still worth fighting for, even though the organization had failed them so completely. Even though they were dying because other Minutemen had chosen political disputes over their sworn obligations to protect the Commonwealth. Preston tried to argue, tried to insist that Hollis would survive if they could just get him to proper medical care. But his commander's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength, and Hollis's eyes demanded honesty about what they both knew was happening. There was no time for comfortable lies, no room for denial when every second of delay meant more people dying while Preston pretended his mentor was not bleeding to death in his arms. Hollis needed Preston to accept command immediately, to start making the decisions that would determine how many people survived the next few hours. And he needed Preston to understand that leadership under these circumstances meant bearing the weight of impossible choices and living with the guilt of everyone he failed to save. Colonel Hollis died before Preston could properly respond, his final breath escaping with a sound that was less dramatic than Preston would have expected for the moment when everything he believed in died, along with the man who had embodied those beliefs. Preston knelt beside the body for perhaps 3 seconds, allowing himself that tiny fragment of time to acknowledge what had just happened, before forcing himself to stand and resume the role that Hollis had thrust upon him with his final words. The grief and shock would have to wait, because people were still dying, and Preston was now responsible for minimizing how many more would join the dead before this catastrophe concluded. The fighting retreat continued under Preston's command, with him making decisions based on training and instinct, rather than conscious thought, his mind operating in the kind of dissociated state that trauma sometimes creates when normal psychological processing would prevent necessary action. He called out orders to the surviving Minutemen, coordinating their withdrawal in ways that maintained enough defensive coherence to prevent the retreat from becoming a rout that would allow gunners to slaughter everyone who fled. He helped civilians navigate escape routes while providing covering fire, his laser musket becoming an extension of his body that killed with mechanical efficiency, while his conscious mind observed from some distant remove that prevented the immediate horror from overwhelming his functionality. The massacre of civilians occurred despite Preston's best efforts, because the gunners were not interested in taking prisoners or extracting tribute, but rather in eliminating Quincy as an example of what happened to settlements that resisted their operations. Families that Preston tried to evacuate were caught by flanking gunner forces and killed in front of him before he could redirect enough firepower to suppress the threat. Elderly people who could not move quickly enough to keep pace with the retreat were overtaken and executed where they fell, their deaths serving no tactical purpose beyond demonstrating that the gunners would accept no survivors who might later seek revenge or testify to what had happened. Children died in their parents' arms or alone in rubble where they had hidden, hoping to escape notice. And each death was another weight added to the burden of guilt that Preston was accumulating with every moment he remained alive, while others around him fell. The remaining Minutemen from Hollis's company were picked off throughout the retreat by gunner forces that maintained pressure against their defensive line without giving them opportunity to establish strong positions or catch their breath. Preston watched people he had known for years die in ways that ranged from instant and merciful to prolonged and agonizing, each death diminishing the company's capability to protect the civilians they were shepherding, while simultaneously removing people whose presence had made Preston feel less alone in facing the overwhelming horror of what was happening. By the time they finally broke contact with the gunners and reached something approaching safety beyond Quincy's perimeter, fewer than 20 people remained of the 200 who had populated the town that morning, and the 30 who had comprised Hollis's company when they arrived to provide assistance. The survivors gathered in a small ravine that provided concealment and defensible positions if the gunners decided to pursue, though Preston suspected that the mercenaries would be satisfied with their victory and the substantial payment they would receive for successfully eliminating Quincy as a competitor or threat to whoever had hired them. He counted the people under his protection with growing horror as the magnitude of the failure became impossible to deny or minimize. Approximately 20 people, mix of Minutemen and Quincy civilians, most wounded to some degree, all traumatized beyond anything that normal psychological resilience could easily process, looking to Preston for leadership and protection and hope that he did not possess because everything he had believed about the Minutemen and their capacity to protect the Commonwealth had just been proven catastrophically wrong. Preston's immediate psychological state in the aftermath of Quincy was a kind of functional numbness, his mind protecting itself from the full weight of what had just happened by processing events at a superficial level that allowed him to continue making decisions without breaking down completely. He organized the survivors into a march formation that would allow them to move while maintaining some defensive capability, assigned the least wounded to help carry those who could not walk unassisted, and began leading them away from Quincy towards some destination that he had not yet identified, because all he knew was that staying near the massacre site meant risking gunner return or opportunistic raider attacks against people who lacked the capacity to defend themselves effectively, the knowledge that other Minutemen companies had abandoned them, that the promised reinforcements had never arrived because commanders who should have honored their commitments chose instead to preserve their own resources and avoid entanglement in a difficult operation, was almost more devastating than the physical defeat at gunner hands. Preston understood intellectually that Clint's betrayal and the tactical situation would have made Quincy difficult to hold, even with proper reinforcements. But he also knew that with support from the other companies that had promised assistance, they might have evacuated more civilians, might have held longer, might have saved Colonel Hollis and the other Minutemen who died buying time for retreats that would not have been necessary if the organization had functioned as it was supposed to. The betrayal was comprehensive and multi-layered, combining Clint's active assistance to the gunners with the passive abandonment of other Minutemen commanders who broke their promises of support. And together these betrayals had killed not just specific people, but the last remnants of Preston's faith in the organization he had devoted his adult life to serving. The Minutemen had not merely failed at Quincy, but had actively contributed to the massacre through their dysfunction and cowardice, had proven that the ideals Preston believed in were insufficient to overcome human selfishness and institutional decay, had demonstrated that everything he had been fighting for was built on foundations too weak to support the weight of genuine crisis. The civilians in Preston's care looked to him with expressions that combined hope and desperation and trust that he had not earned and did not deserve, expecting him to lead them to safety and protection that he had no idea how to provide. These were people who had called for Minutemen help and received inadequate assistance that had merely delayed rather than prevented their destruction, who had lost their homes and families because Preston and his company had not been strong enough or numerous enough to hold against superior force, who now depended entirely on his leadership, despite overwhelming evidence that his leadership was inadequate for keeping people alive in the Commonwealth's brutal reality. Preston wanted to tell them that they were trusting the wrong person, that he was just a soldier who had never wanted command and had certainly never imagined receiving it, under circumstances where every decision would be choosing between bad options and worse ones. He wanted to explain that Colonel Hollis had been the leader worth following, and that his death had removed the one person who might have guided them through this catastrophe with wisdom and experience that Preston entirely lacked. He wanted to confess that he had no plan beyond moving away from Quincy and hoping they encountered no threats that his diminished force could not handle, that he was making everything up as he went along and praying that his inexperience would not get them all killed. But the survivors needed him to project confidence and competence, regardless of what he actually felt, needed to believe that someone knew what they were doing and would guide them through the immediate dangers towards some eventual safety. Preston forced himself to meet their eyes when they looked to him for reassurance, forced himself to speak with firmness when giving orders about how to organize their march and what to do if they encountered threats, forced himself to act like a leader, even though he felt like a frightened young man who wanted nothing more than to find somewhere to hide and process the trauma of watching everyone he cared about die because the organization he believed in had proven itself unworthy of that belief. The guilt began to settle over Preston during those first hours after Quincy, a weight that would never fully lift regardless of how much time passed or what he accomplished in future years. He blamed himself for not being good enough to save Hollis, for not anticipating Clint's betrayal, for not somehow forcing the other Minutemen commanders to honor their commitments, for surviving when so many others had died, including people who were better and braver and more deserving of life than he felt himself to be. The rational part of his mind understood that he bore no responsibility for decisions made by gunner mercenaries or traitorous former comrades or cowardly Minutemen commanders. But rationality was irrelevant when weighed against the visceral reality of being alive while bodies lay cooling in Quincy's ruins. The march away from Quincy began in darkness as night fell over the Commonwealth, and Preston led his survivors through terrain that was dangerous, even without the added burden of wounded people and traumatized children who could not move quickly or quietly. Every sound in the darkness might be raiders or gunners or super mutants, or any of the countless threats that made Commonwealth nights lethal for inadequately defended groups, and Preston found himself constantly scanning their surroundings with paranoia that was entirely appropriate given their vulnerability. He had perhaps 15 people capable of fighting if they were attacked, and several of those were wounded badly enough that their combat effectiveness was questionable at best, meaning any substantial threat would likely overwhelm them before they could mount effective resistance. The first night passed without major incident, beyond the psychological torture of constant vigilance and the physical exhaustion of marching while wounded and traumatized. But morning brought no relief or sense of safety, because every dawn in the Commonwealth meant merely that threats would be visible before killing them, rather than arriving as surprises from darkness. Preston called a halt when they reached a defensible position near a mostly collapsed building that offered some shelter and concealment, allowing people to rest and treating wounds that had been neglected during the desperate flight from Quincy, but could no longer be ignored without risking infection and death from injuries that should have been survivable. The medical supplies that the survivors possessed were woefully inadequate for the number and severity of injuries that Preston's limited knowledge of field medicine told him required immediate attention. He found himself making triage decisions about who received the precious antibiotics and painkillers they had salvaged, choices that meant some people would suffer more than necessary, and others might die from complications that proper medical care could have prevented. Each decision added to the accumulating weight of command, the understanding that leadership meant bearing responsibility for outcomes that he could influence but not fully control, that trying his best would never be sufficient justification when people died, because he allocated resources incorrectly or made wrong choices about who needed treatment most urgently. Preston stood watch that first morning while the survivors slept or tried to sleep despite their wounds and trauma, his mind beginning to process what had happened at Quincy, now that immediate survival demands allowed space for reflection. He understood that he had witnessed not just a military defeat, but the death of everything the Minutemen had claimed to represent, the final proof that the organization's ideals were fantasies that could not survive contact with the Commonwealth's brutal reality, the betrayal by former comrades, the abandonment by commanders who should have provided support, the systematic murder of people he had sworn to protect. All of it confirmed that his faith had been misplaced, that the heroes he believed in were either dead like Hollis, or corrupted like Clint, or cowardly like the commanders who broke their promises. The knowledge that he was now responsible for approximately 20 survivors who depended entirely on his leadership felt like a burden beyond his capacity to bear, and for the first time since joining the Minutemen, Preston found himself wishing that he had died at Quincy along with Hollis and the others. Death would have been simpler than this. He would have relieved him of the responsibility for keeping people alive when he possessed neither the resources, nor the knowledge, nor the emotional strength to provide them with anything approaching adequate protection or care. But death had not come for him, despite multiple opportunities during the battle, and now he was trapped by the obligations that Hollis's final words had placed upon him. Committed to protecting people, he would inevitably fail, because failure was the only possible outcome when circumstances were impossible and help was not coming. Preston Garvey stood watch over sleeping survivors on that first morning after Quincy and understood that his life had fundamentally changed in ways that could never be reversed or healed. The idealistic young man who had joined the Minutemen, believing he could make the Commonwealth a better place, had died in Quincy's ruins, along with Colonel Hollis, and what remained was someone who no longer believed in anything except the immediate necessity of keeping people alive for one more day, even though tomorrow would bring only new challenges that he was equally unequipped to handle. The long walk had begun, and it would take him through depths of despair and suffering that would make Quincy seem like merely the first chapter in a story whose conclusion would be his own death whenever he finally managed to get these people somewhere safe, enough that his continued survival was no longer necessary for theirs. The sun rose higher over the Commonwealth, indifferent to human tragedy, illuminating a world where good people died despite their best efforts, and organizations built on noble ideals collapsed under the weight of human weakness and betrayal. Preston Garvey had learned these lessons in the most brutal way possible, and they would shape everything he became in the years ahead, defining him as much as his sincere belief in protecting others had once defined the boy who joined the Minutemen. Believing heroes were real and goodness could triumph if people just tried hard enough. He knew better now, and the knowledge was crushing, and there was no escape from carrying it forward into whatever future awaited. Beyond this moment of awful clarity about how the world actually worked and what human nature actually permitted, even people who claimed to be defenders of civilization to do to each other and to the innocents who trusted them. The immediate aftermath of Quincy found Preston leading approximately 20 survivors through Commonwealth territory that seemed designed to punish people who had already suffered beyond reasonable human capacity to endure. The group consisted of his fellow Minutemen who had survived the battle, perhaps 8 or 9 soldiers, whose exact number Preston kept losing track of because his mind refused to focus on details that forced him to acknowledge how few remained of Hollis's company, and a slightly larger number of Quincy civilians, who ranged from families with young children to elderly individuals whose presence slowed the group's movement to a pace that made them vulnerable to any predator capable of tracking their obvious trail through the wasteland. Preston's state of mind during those first days after the massacre was a kind of functional dissociation, his consciousness operating at sufficient level to make necessary decisions about direction and security, while the deeper parts of his psyche remained locked away behind walls that prevented him from fully processing what had happened or acknowledging the magnitude of his losses. He gave orders about march formation and rest breaks and defensive positioning with the mechanical precision of someone executing pre-programmed responses rather than engaging in genuine thought, his voice sounding strange and distant, even to his own ears, as if he were listening to someone else speak through his body, while his actual self observed from some remote location where the horror could not reach him. The search for somewhere safe to shelter began with what Preston recognized even then was desperate optimism, the irrational hope that surely some settlement would take in refugees from Quincy, despite the obvious risks and burdens that 20 additional mouths would represent in a commonwealth where resources were always scarce and charity was a luxury that most communities could not afford. He led his survivors towards settlements that he knew from previous Minutemen operations, places where Hollis's company had provided protection or assistance, and where Preston hoped the memory of that service might translate into willingness to help when the Minutemen themselves needed sanctuary. The first settlement they approached was a farming community that Preston remembered defending against super mutant attacks during the good years, when the Minutemen's reputation still meant something and communities welcomed their arrival as salvation, rather than viewing them with suspicion. The settlement's response to Preston's request for shelter was not overtly hostile, but rather the kind of uncomfortable refusal that comes from people who understand that compassion conflicts with survival but choose survival anyway, because that is what the Commonwealth demands from those who wish to continue existing. They explained that they barely had resources for their own people, that taking in 20 refugees would strain their food supplies beyond sustainability, that the gunners might pursue the Quincy survivors, and any settlement harboring them would become targets for mercenary retribution. Preston understood the logic of their refusal, even as it felt like another betrayal. Another confirmation that the Commonwealth offered no safety or solidarity, but only the harsh mathematics of resource scarcity and risk assessment. He led his people away from the settlement without argument or recrimination, because what could he say that would change the fundamental calculus that made helping them dangerous and letting them die convenient? The civilians in his care did not understand as clearly as Preston did why they were being turned away, and he saw the hurt and confusion in their faces as they resumed marching towards some other destination that would probably also refuse them, because every settlement made the same calculations and reached the same conclusions about not risking their own survival for strangers. Other settlements offered variations on this same response throughout the first week after Quincy, each refusal delivered with different degrees of sympathy or callousness, but always reaching the same practical conclusion that sheltering Quincy refugees represented an unacceptable risk or burden. Some settlements feared gunner reprisals if they helped people who had fled from mercenary justice, not understanding or not caring that Quincy's destruction had been motivated by commercial competition rather than any genuine crime that justified the massacre. Others simply lacked the resources to feed additional people through the coming winter, their own survival margins too thin to accommodate charity, even for families with children who would certainly die if forced to remain in the wasteland without proper shelter. Preston stopped asking after the fourth or fifth rejection, understanding that his requests were subjecting the survivors to repeated experiences of hope, followed by disappointment. That added psychological trauma to their already overwhelming burden of physical injury and emotional devastation. Instead, he led them along trade routes and through less populated areas, hoping they might find an abandoned settlement or defensible ruin that could serve as temporary shelter, while he figured out what to do with people who apparently had no place in a commonwealth that had collectively decided their survival was not worth the inconvenience it would require from communities that might have helped. The first deaths among the survivors came within days of leaving Quincy, before Preston had fully accepted that no settlement would shelter them, and they were truly alone in facing whatever the Commonwealth chose to inflict upon people already broken by trauma and loss. An elderly man who had survived the gunner assault succumbed to infected wounds that Preston's inadequate medical supplies and limited knowledge could not properly treat, dying quietly during a rest stop while Preston was checking the perimeter for threats and not holding his hand or offering comfort during his final moments. Preston discovered the body when he returned from his security check and felt a guilt that was disproportionate to any actual failure on his part. Understanding intellectually that the man's death was probably inevitable given the severity of his injuries, but unable to escape the feeling that better leadership or more attentive care might have kept him alive. The pattern established itself with horrifying consistency over the following weeks as the Commonwealth demonstrated through brutal repetition that it offered no mercy to people who lacked the resources and capabilities to defend themselves adequately. An elderly woman died from pneumonia that developed from exposure during cold nights when they lacked sufficient shelter or warm clothing to protect vulnerable members of their group. A child succumbed to dehydration after drinking contaminated water during a period when their purification tablets had run out, and Preston's desperation to keep the group moving prevented them from waiting the necessary time for water to settle and become safer through natural processes. Each death was simultaneously predictable given their circumstances and utterly devastating in its confirmation that Preston's leadership was insufficient to keep people alive, despite his best efforts and sincere commitment to their ruse. Welfare. The raiders who found them during the second week after Quincy were not a large gang, but rather a small group of perhaps 6 or 7 opportunists who recognized easy prey when they encountered it. A group of wounded and exhausted people whose defensive capabilities were obviously inadequate for their numbers. Preston's diminished force of Minutemen, already reduced from the original 30 to perhaps 8 or 9 effective soldiers, managed to drive off the raider attack through disciplined fire and tactical positioning that exploited the raiders' assumption that traumatized refugees would be easy victims. But the engagement cost them 2 more Minutemen, whose deaths were particularly crushing because these were people Preston had known for years. Brothers in arms who had survived Quincy only to die defending refugees from opportunistic predators in circumstances that felt meaningless compared to the battle they had already endured. The gradual attrition of their numbers created a psychological weight that exceeded the practical burden of reduced defensive capability, each loss diminishing not just their strength, but their collective will to continue struggling when struggle seemed only to prolong inevitable extinction. Preston watched the survivors grow quieter and more withdrawn as hope eroded under constant assault from circumstances that offered no relief or suggestion that their situation might improve through continued effort. The children stopped playing. The adults stopped talking, except when necessary to coordinate movement or address immediate needs. and everyone moved with the mechanical exhaustion of people who continue functioning only because stopping would mean immediate death, and their bodies had not yet overridden survival instincts to simply give up. Preston's own psychological state deteriorated in parallel with the group's declining numbers and morale. The weight of responsibility for keeping people alive, combining with the accumulating evidence of his inadequacy to produce a kind of spiritual exhaustion that went beyond anything physical rest could address. He continued making decisions about routes and security and resource allocation with the same mechanical competence that had characterized his leadership since Quincy, but the sense of purpose that might have animated these decisions was entirely absent, replaced by a kind of hollow determination to continue through the motions of leadership, because stopping meant acknowledging that everything he did was meaningless, and everyone depending on him would have been better served by a commander who actually believed their survival mattered. The ghoul attacks that cost them 3 more people, including one of Preston's few remaining fellow Minutemen, came at a time when the group's vigilance had been worn down by weeks of constant movement and inadequate rest. Feral ghouls, mindless creatures driven by radiation-damaged brains that retained only predatory instincts, swarmed from the ruins of a pre-war building where the group had taken shelter for the night. Overwhelming defensive positions before Preston could organize effective response to the threat. The Minuteman who died was someone Preston had trained alongside, had fought beside through dozens of operations during the good years, and his death while defending civilians from creatures that should never have breached their perimeter felt like another personal failure that added to Preston's accumulating conviction that his continued survival was undeserved. Punishment rather than fortunate circumstance. The number of survivors shrank with each passing week until Preston lost accurate count of how many remained, because keeping track required acknowledging specific losses that his mind could not process without breaking down entirely. He knew, in a general sense, that they had started with approximately 20 people after Quincy, and were now perhaps 15 or 12, or some number between those figures. But the exact count eluded him, because counting meant remembering names and faces of those who had died under his inadequate protection. The Quincy civilians looked to him with expressions that had evolved from hope to resignation to a kind of blank endurance that suggested they continued following his lead, more from habit than belief that he would actually guide them to safety. The remaining Minutemen from Hollis's company died one by one throughout the long walk, each death removing another connection to Preston's previous life and identity as part of something larger than himself. A Minuteman named Sarah died, defending the group from another raider attack, her body absorbing bullets that might otherwise have killed civilians she positioned herself to protect. A Minuteman whose name Preston's exhausted memory could not immediately retrieve succumbed to infected wounds that slowly poisoned his system, despite Preston's attempts to treat them with inadequate medical supplies. Another died when a patrol encountered super mutants in territory they had been forced to traverse because safer routes were blocked or controlled by threats they lacked the strength to challenge. By the time they approached the outskirts of Concord, approximately 3 weeks after fleeing Quincy, Preston Garvey had become the last actual Minuteman in the group, the sole surviving representative of an organization that had failed so completely that its name had become synonymous with betrayal and abandonment throughout the Commonwealth. The civilians who remained numbered perhaps 8 or 9, though Preston's mental fog prevented precise counting, and he told himself the exact number did not matter because they would all be dead soon anyway, and counting them merely delayed, acknowledging that inevitability. These were the Longs, a married couple whose determination to stay together had somehow sustained them through circumstances that had killed younger and stronger individuals. Mama Murphy, an old woman whose addiction to psychoactive chems had given her visions that she claimed foretold their eventual salvation, though Preston had long since stopped believing in salvation from any source. Marcy and Jun, a young couple whose child had died during the flight from Quincy and whose grief had made them bitter toward everyone, including each other. Sturgis, a handyman whose practical skills had kept equipment functional and improvised solutions to problems that would otherwise have killed them. The decision to shelter in the Museum of Freedom in Concord was not made from hope or tactical calculation, but rather from exhaustion so complete that continuing to march seemed literally impossible for people who had been moving constantly for weeks without adequate food or rest, or any indication that their destination would offer more than temporary delay before final extinction. The museum was a pre-war building that had maintained more structural integrity than most ruins, offering actual walls and roof rather than the partial shelter they had been making do with during most of their journey. And the presence of a power armor display suggested that someone had once considered the location defensible enough to leave valuable equipment behind. Preston led the survivors into the museum and began establishing defensive positions with the same mechanical competence that had characterized all his actions since Quincy, checking sightlines and designating fields of fire, and ensuring that their limited ammunition was positioned to maximize effectiveness if they were attacked. But his heart was not in the preparations because his heart was not anywhere, was not part of his conscious experience anymore, but had been left behind in Quincy's ruins, along with Colonel Hollis and everyone else who had mattered to him before the massacre taught him that caring about people only created opportunities for devastating loss. The raider attack that trapped them in the museum came within days of their arrival. A gang that had been tracking their movements and waiting for them to establish themselves somewhere before launching assault that would either kill them or drive them into flight, that would leave behind whatever supplies and equipment they had accumulated. Preston's defensive preparations proved adequate to repel the initial attack, the raiders not expecting organized resistance from what they had assumed would be easy victims. But the engagement cost them ammunition they could not replace, and demonstrated that the museum was surrounded by enemies who would eventually overwhelm their defenses through simple attrition. The survivors were reduced to 5 people by the time the siege settled into its final form. The museum surrounded by raiders who lacked either the courage or the ammunition to launch another direct assault, but were content to wait until starvation or desperation forced their prey to emerge. Preston had himself, the Longs, Mama Murphy, Marcy and June, and Sturgis, 7 people total if he was counting correctly, though his exhaustion made even basic arithmetic difficult. They had perhaps enough ammunition for one more engagement of the intensity they had faced during the initial raider attack. Enough food for maybe 2 weeks if they rationed carefully, and no prospect whatsoever of rescue or relief, because no one was coming to help, and no one would even know they had died here when the raiders finally decided to finish what they had started. Preston's acceptance of death during this period was not the kind of active suicidal ideation that involves planning specific methods of self-destruction, but rather a passive welcoming of whatever end might come, a sense that dying would be relief rather than tragedy, and that his continued survival served no purpose beyond prolonging the suffering of people he was failing to protect. He had failed at Quincy, allowing Colonel Hollis and most of his company to die despite his best efforts to save them. He had failed during the long walk, watching people die one by one from injuries and illness and attacks that better leadership might have prevented. He was failing now in this museum, keeping people alive only to die more slowly from starvation rather than quickly from raider bullets. And the universe would be better served by his removal from it, so that perhaps someone more competent might take his place and actually succeed where he had consistently failed. The specific quality of Preston's death wish during this period was characterized by the belief that death was what he deserved as appropriate punishment for his failures, that remaining alive while so many others had died represented a cosmic injustice that needed correction. He had not earned survival through any particular competence or virtue, but had simply gotten lucky repeatedly, while people more deserving of life had fallen around him, and continuing to accept that luck felt like stealing life, that should have gone to Colonel Hollis or Sarah, or the child who died from contaminated water, or any of the dozens of others whose deaths Preston bore responsibility for through his inadequacy as a leader and protector. Death would not be tragedy, but rather justice, the restoration of proper moral order in a universe that had temporarily malfunctioned by allowing him to survive when he should have died. Preston found himself hoping during quiet moments on watch that the next raider attack would succeed, that a bullet would find him and end the exhausting pretense that his leadership mattered, or that his continued efforts made any difference to outcomes that were predetermined by forces beyond his control. He imagined dying quickly and cleanly, the way Hollis had died at Quincy, and the fantasy was not horrifying but almost comforting in its promise of release from the burden of consciousness and responsibility. He did not actively seek death by deliberately exposing himself to raider fire or sabotaging their defenses, because his training and instincts were too deeply ingrained to allow such obvious suicide. But he stopped caring whether he lived or died, and found himself almost disappointed when dangerous situations resolved without claiming his life. The month in the Museum of Freedom passed in a kind of timeless suspension, where days blended together into undifferentiated stretches of boredom, punctuated by brief moments of terror when raiders tested their defenses or supplies ran dangerously low. Preston maintained watch rotations and enforced ammunition discipline, and made the other small decisions that kept 5 people alive in a building surrounded by enemies. But he performed these duties without any sense that they mattered beyond delaying inevitable outcomes. The civilians looked to him for hope or reassurance that he could not provide, because hope required believing that the future might be different from the present, and Preston's experience had thoroughly crushed any such belief. Mama Murphy's visions became increasingly important to the group's psychological survival during this period. Her chem-fueled prophecies of eventual rescue, providing the only narrative that offered salvation rather than slow death by starvation or quick death by raider assault. She spoke about a stranger who would come from the vault, someone who would save them and lead them to a new life beyond the museum's walls. And Preston listened to these prophecies with the detached interest of someone humoring a delusional person, because kindness cost nothing and correcting her false hopes served no purpose, when hope was all that kept some of the survivors from giving up entirely. Preston's lowest psychological point during this period was characterized by the absolute conviction that everything he had believed about the Minutemen and their mission had been lies, that the ideals he had devoted his life to serving were naive fantasies that could not survive contact with the Commonwealth's brutal reality. The Minutemen had not been heroes protecting the innocent, but rather armed groups pursuing their own interests while using protective rhetoric to justify their authority over settlements. Colonel Hollis had not been a visionary leader, but rather a stubborn idealist who had gotten himself and his company killed through refusing to adapt to organizational realities. Preston himself had not been a defender of civilization, but rather a naive boy playing soldier, while actual adults made the hard choices about survival that he had been too immature to understand. The knowledge that he was the last failed representative of a failed organization weighed on Preston with crushing heaviness. The understanding that when he died, the Minutemen would be truly extinct, because no one would remember what they had claimed to stand for, or care that they had once tried to protect the Commonwealth from forces that were now free to prey on settlements without organized resistance. His death would mark the end of an experiment in organized altruism that the Commonwealth had rejected as impractical, and the world would be no worse off for that ending, because the Minutemen's actual contributions had been negligible compared to their grandiose claims about making the Commonwealth a better place. Preston thought occasionally about simply walking out of the museum and into raider gunfire, ending the charade that his leadership mattered, or that the 5 people depending on him had any prospect of survival beyond the next few weeks. The only thing that prevented this action was not hope or duty or any positive motivation, but rather a kind of stubborn inertia that kept him functioning according to established patterns, even when those patterns no longer served any meaningful purpose. He had been trained to protect people, and he would continue protecting people until circumstances made that impossible, not because protection mattered, but because he literally did not know what else to do with himself when the alternative was confronting the absolute meaninglessness of his continued existence. The thought that he might still be around if circumstances had been different, if he had killed himself immediately after Quincy, or if the raiders had been more competent during their initial assault, troubled Preston in ways that suggested some part of him still retained attachment to life, despite his conscious wish for death. He knew that he would have found some way to end it eventually, maybe not by shooting himself in the head, but simply by not caring about staying alive enough to take the precautions that survival required in the Commonwealth's dangerous environment. Without the civilians depending on him for protection, he might already be dead, might have taken unnecessary risks, or failed to maintain vigilance during crucial moments. And his continued survival was not a blessing but merely delayed punishment, postponement of justice that would eventually arrive when he finally failed the people he was trying to protect completely enough that his death became the appropriate price for his inadequacy. Preston Garvey stood watch over sleeping survivors during his final days in the Museum of Freedom, looking out over Concord's ruins and seeing nothing that suggested hope or possibility beyond the immediate horizon of continued decline toward inevitable extinction. He was 25 years old and felt ancient, weighted down by losses and failures that had compressed decades of aging into weeks of concentrated trauma. The boy who had joined the Minutemen, believing in heroes and ideals and the possibility of making the Commonwealth better, was so completely gone that Preston could barely remember what that naive optimism had felt like, could not connect his current self to the person he had been before. Quincy taught him that everything he believed was a lie, and everyone who believed in those lies deserved exactly what they got. The moment when everything would change was approaching, though Preston could not have known it, had no reason to suspect that salvation might actually arrive in the form Mama Murphy's visions had described. The morning of the sole survivor's arrival was beginning in the Commonwealth beyond the museum's walls, and with it came the possibility of hope rekindled and faith restored and purpose rediscovered, in circumstances that seemed designed to prove that despair was the only rational response to human existence. But that transformation lay in the future, and for now, Preston Garvey remained trapped in the present moment of absolute conviction that he was waiting only for death to arrive and release him from the burden of leadership he had never wanted and the guilt of failures he could never escape. The long walk from Quincy had taken him through more than mere physical distance, had carried him across psychological terrain where everything he valued was systematically destroyed until nothing remained but hollow determination to keep functioning because the alternative required more energy than he possessed. He was empty, broken, waiting for the end, and the fact that end had not yet arrived felt like cosmic cruelty rather than fortunate circumstance. Preston Garvey wanted to die, not dramatically or immediately, but simply to stop existing so that he would no longer have to carry the weight of everyone he had failed and everything he had lost, and all the proof that his faith had been misplaced from the very beginning of his time with the Minutemen. The morning that would divide Preston Garvey's life into before and after, the moment when everything he had resigned himself to losing was offered back to him in a form he could barely recognize as possibility rather than mere postponement of inevitable extinction, began, like countless other mornings in the Museum of Freedom, with Preston standing watch at a broken window, while the 5 survivors he had failed to save slept fitfully in what passed for shelter. The sun rose over Concord's ruins with the same indifference it had shown to every previous dawn, illuminating a world that cared nothing for human suffering or the quiet desperation of people waiting to die. And Preston watched that sunrise with the hollow appreciation of someone who understood beauty intellectually but could no longer feel its emotional impact, because feeling anything seemed like energy wasted on pointless engagement with a reality that offered nothing worth feeling. The stranger's approach through raider-controlled territory registered first as tactical concern rather than hope, Preston's training asserting itself automatically despite his psychological resignation to death. He observed through his weapon's sights as a figure moved with obvious purpose toward the museum, navigating around raider positions with competence that suggested military experience, or at least familiarity with combat movement in hostile environments. The logical assumption was that this person would be killed or driven off by the raiders who had been besieging the museum for weeks. That Preston was witnessing merely another Commonwealth tragedy in the making, as someone foolish enough to approach Concord without understanding its dangers walked into slaughter that could not be prevented from his position. But the stranger did not die or flee when raiders moved to intercept them, did not freeze or panic when faced with superior numbers and hostile intent. Instead, they engaged with a precision and lethality that suggested capabilities far beyond what typical Commonwealth survivors possessed, dropping raiders with carefully aimed shots that conserved ammunition while maximizing casualties among enemies who had apparently not expected genuine resistance from what they assumed would be easy prey. Preston watched this combat unfold with growing fascination that penetrated through his numbness, seeing in the stranger's movements and tactical decisions something he had not witnessed since Colonel Hollis died at Quincy, someone who actually knew what they were doing in combat situations, and who fought with the kind of grim determination that came from having survived worse than raiders before. The engagement concluded with dead raiders scattered around the museum's perimeter and the stranger approaching the building's entrance with weapons still ready, moving with appropriate caution for someone entering an unknown structure that might contain additional threats. Preston called down from his elevated position, identifying himself as Minutemen and explaining the situation with raiders while trying to keep desperation out of his voice, because desperation suggested vulnerability, and vulnerability invited exploitation from people who might view trapped survivors as opportunities for profit rather than humans deserving of assistance. His expectations for the stranger's response were calibrated by weeks of rejection from settlements and months of watching the Commonwealth demonstrate its indifference to suffering. So when the stranger agreed without hesitation to help clear the raiders from the museum, Preston's initial reaction was confusion rather than relief, because help without expectation of payment seemed too good to be credible. The battle to clear the museum proceeded with Preston and the stranger fighting alongside each other in a coordination that should not have been possible between people who had just met but somehow worked, because both of them possessed the clearie, training and instincts that made combat an arena where competence spoke louder than words. Preston found himself moving through the museum's interior with more energy and purpose than he had felt since Quincy, his body responding to the presence of someone capable of actually making a difference, rather than merely delaying inevitable defeat. The raiders fell quickly under their combined assault, their siege broken by the sudden introduction of an element they had not anticipated and could not counter with their usual tactics of intimidation and overwhelming numbers. When the last raider fell and silence replaced the sound of sustained gunfire, Preston stood in the museum's main hall, surrounded by evidence of their victory, and felt something he had thought permanently dead, stirring somewhere deep in the frozen wasteland where his emotions used to reside. It was not joy exactly, not even relief in any complete sense, but rather a tiny crack in the absolute certainty that he was waiting only to die, a microscopic opening through which the possibility of something other than extinction might eventually enter if circumstances continued to defy his expectations. He was alive, the 5 survivors were alive, and they had been saved by a stranger who had risked their life to help people they did not know, for reasons Preston could not yet understand, because his experience of the Commonwealth had taught him that such altruism did not exist. Outside of naive fantasies about human goodness, the conversation that followed the combat revealed information about the stranger that forced Preston to recalibrate his understanding of what was possible in the post-war world and who might still embody the ideals he had thought. died with Colonel Hollis at Quincy. The sole survivor, as they came to be known, had emerged from a pre-war vault after 2 centuries of cryogenic suspension, entering the Commonwealth with no understanding of its current dangers or dynamics, but possessing capabilities that suggested military training from before the Great War. They were searching for their kidnapped child, had no connection to any of the factions currently operating in the region, and had helped Preston's group for no reason beyond the simple fact that people needed help, and helping seemed like the right thing to do. Preston found himself explaining about Quincy and the Minutemen, and the long walk that had reduced his group from 20 survivors to 5, talking more than he had talked in weeks. Because something about the sole survivor's calm competence and obvious willingness to listen made communication feel possible rather than merely performative. He described the massacre and the betrayals and the settlements that had turned them away, laying out the full extent of the Minutemen's failure and his own inadequacy as a leader, expecting that once the survivor understood the complete picture, they would make excuses and leave, because no rational person would involve themselves further with failures of Preston's magnitude. But the sole survivor did not leave or make excuses or suggest that Preston's problems were beyond their capacity to address. Instead, they asked what Preston needed, what would actually help the survivors move beyond their current crisis towards something approaching safety and stability. And the question was so unexpected that Preston initially struggled to formulate a coherent response, because he had stopped thinking in terms of needs that might actually be met rather than merely postponed. When he finally managed to articulate that they needed assistance defending Ten Pines Bluff, a small settlement that had called for help and represented an opportunity to prove that the Minutemen could still serve their protective function, the sole survivor agreed without hesitation or negotiation about payment, or even extended discussion about the dangers involved. The journey to Ten Pines Bluff proceeded with Preston operating in a state of cautious disbelief, half expecting the sole survivor to come to their senses and abandon the commitment they had made once the immediate adrenaline of combat wore off and rational calculation about risk versus reward reasserted itself. But the survivor maintained their course and their commitment, asking intelligent questions about the settlement and the threats it faced, while demonstrating through their preparations and tactical planning that they took the mission seriously rather than viewing it as a favor they might withdraw if circumstances became inconvenient. Preston found himself responding to this competence and reliability with the first stirrings of something that might eventually become hope if it survived long enough to be identified as such, rather than being crushed by the next. Inevitable disappointment. The defense of Ten Pines Bluff was not a major engagement by any objective military standard, merely a small group of raiders threatening a settlement of farmers who lacked adequate defensive capabilities. But its significance to Preston transcended the tactical details, because it represented the first time since Quincy that he had succeeded in protecting people he had promised to help. The sole survivor fought with the same competence they had demonstrated at the museum, their pre-war military training translating effectively to post-war combat, despite the 2-century gap and the changed circumstances. And together they drove off the raiders with casualties only among the enemies rather than among the people they were defending. The settlers expressed gratitude with the kind of genuine warmth that Preston had almost forgotten could be directed toward Minutemen, treating them as saviors rather than as burdens or threats or irrelevant anachronisms from an organization that no longer mattered. The psychological impact of this successful defense on Preston's mental state was disproportionate to the objective significance of the engagement, because it contradicted the narrative of inevitable failure that had defined his existence since Quincy. He had led people into combat, and they had survived, had promised protection, and actually delivered it, had fulfilled the Minutemen's core mission of defending Commonwealth settlements against threats they could not handle alone. The success did not erase Quincy, or redeem his failures during the long walk, or prove that his leadership was adequate for the challenges he faced. but it created a tiny data point, suggesting that perhaps his continued existence served some purpose beyond merely accumulating additional failures before death finally arrived to release him from his obligations. The sole survivor's behavior throughout this operation and in its aftermath challenged Preston's assumptions about human nature and the possibility of genuine altruism in ways that forced him to reconsider whether his post-Quincy worldview was accurate assessment of reality or merely trauma-induced cynicism that mistook his specific experiences for universal truth. The survivor had risked their life to help strangers, had asked nothing in return beyond the opportunity to continue helping, had treated the defense of a small farm settlement as if it mattered just as much as their personal quest to find their kidnapped child. These actions embodied the ideals that Preston had believed died with Colonel Hollis, suggested that the values the Minutemen claimed to represent were not naive fantasies, but achievable realities if people with sufficient capability and commitment chose to pursue them. Preston found himself watching the sole survivor with an intensity that bordered on obsession during the days that followed, analyzing their decisions and motivations while trying to understand what kind of person could emerge from a pre-war vault and immediately dedicate themselves to helping Commonwealth settlers without expectation of reward or even basic reciprocity. The survivors' willingness to continue assisting settlements that called for help, to put themselves repeatedly in danger, defending people they did not know and would likely never see again after brief encounters, demonstrated a kind of selflessness that Preston had thought was perhaps unique to Colonel Hollis, or at least exceptionally rare among people who survived long enough in the Commonwealth to develop the cynicism that protected them from exploitation. Other settlements began requesting assistance as word spread that someone was actually responding to calls for help and providing effective protection against threats that had been growing bolder in the absence of organized Minutemen presence. Preston found himself coordinating these requests with the sole survivor, helping them prioritize which settlements needed immediate assistance versus which could wait, providing tactical advice based on his knowledge of Commonwealth threats and terrain. The role of advisor and coordinator felt more comfortable than the leadership position Hollis's death had thrust upon him, allowed him to contribute meaningfully without bearing sole responsibility for outcomes that his experience suggested would inevitably end in failure. The psychological shift occurring within Preston during this period was gradual rather than sudden, a slow thawing of the frozen numbness that had characterized his mental state since watching everyone he cared about die while he survived through luck rather than capability. He began to experience emotional responses again, small flickers of satisfaction when settlements were successfully defended, or concern when the sole survivor took unnecessary risks in combat, or even occasional amusement at Sturgis's attempts to repair equipment with inadequate tools and components. These emotions were muted and fragile compared to what he had felt before Quincy, but their presence suggested that his psychological devastation might not be permanent, that some capacity for feeling beyond mere guilt and despair had survived intact beneath the protective numbness that trauma had imposed. The decision to offer the sole survivor the position of General of the Minutemen emerged from Preston's growing conviction that this person embodied everything the organization should be, and that his own inadequacy as a leader made him unsuitable for the role that Hollis's death had forced upon him. The survivor had proven through their actions that they possessed not just military competence, but the genuine commitment to protecting others that defined the Minutemen's ideals at their purest expression, had demonstrated willingness to sacrifice personal convenience and safety for strangers without requiring the kind of institutional framework or command authority that other leaders seem to need for motivating themselves toward altruistic action. Preston's explanation of why he was offering command to someone he had known only briefly, rather than maintaining leadership himself, revealed depths of self-awareness and insecurity that he rarely allowed others to see. His articulation of his own limitations and the survivor's strengths exposing how completely Quincy had destroyed his confidence in his capacity to lead effectively. He explained that he could get people through firefights and defend perimeters against overwhelming odds, but that tactical competence was insufficient for bringing the Minutemen back from organizational extinction, that what they needed was someone who could inspire Commonwealth settlements to believe in the possibility of coordinated defense and mutual protection, rather than the isolated survival strategies that most communities had adopted after the Minutemen's collapse. The survivor's acceptance of the role carried less weight than Preston's offer, because the survivor did not yet understand what they were committing to, or what the Minutemen had once represented, or how completely the organization had failed before their arrival. But Preston understood the significance of what was happening, recognized that he was witnessing the potential resurrection of ideals he had thought permanently discredited by reality, and the knowledge that someone capable was willing to carry forward the mission that Hollis had died believing in created something approaching joy in the wreckage of Preston's emotional landscape. He would serve this new general with the same loyalty and dedication he had given to Colonel Hollis, would provide whatever support and advice his experience made possible, would commit himself to helping rebuild an organization whose failure had nearly killed him. The promise Preston made to stand beside the sole survivor through whatever challenges lay ahead was perhaps the first genuine commitment to future action he had made since Quincy. The first decision that assumed his continued survival might serve purposes beyond merely postponing death until he had fulfilled minimal obligations to the civilians depending on him. He was not healed or whole or free from the guilt and trauma that Quincy and the long walk had inflicted upon him, but he was no longer actively wishing for death as relief from unbearable psychological burden, no longer viewing his continued existence as cosmic injustice that needed correction through his removal from the world. The transformation was not dramatic or complete because genuine psychological healing from trauma of Preston's magnitude required time and repeated positive experiences that contradicted the narratives trauma had embedded in his mores. Understanding of reality, but the foundation for healing had been established through the sole survivor's arrival and their subsequent demonstration that the ideals Preston had believed in were not naive fantasies, but achievable realities if people with sufficient capability and commitment chose to pursue them. The survivor had saved Preston physically by breaking the raider siege at the museum, but more importantly, they had saved him psychologically by providing evidence that contradicted his post-Quincy conviction that everything he believed was lies, and everyone who believed those lies deserved what they got. Preston found himself thinking about the future again, not with the naive optimism that had characterized his youth before he understood how completely human weakness could undermine even the most noble intentions, but with a cautious hope that recognized possibility alongside danger and understood that success required more than good intentions. The Minutemen could be rebuilt if someone like the sole survivor was willing to lead them, if settlements could be convinced that organized mutual defense offered better prospects than isolated survival, if enough people committed to the ideals of protection and cooperation could be gathered to create institutional momentum that did not depend entirely on single individuals, maintaining everything through personal effort. The realization that he wanted to live again, that his continued existence might serve purposes worth the effort of survival, came to Preston gradually, rather than in a single moment of revelation. He noticed himself taking more care with his equipment maintenance, thinking about tactical problems he might face in future operations, rather than merely responding to immediate crises. Engaging in conversations with the other survivors about plans that extended beyond the next few days. These small behavioral changes suggested that some part of him had decided that life was worth living after all, that the sole survivor's arrival had created conditions where Preston's continued survival might contribute to outcomes he valued, rather than merely adding to accumulated failures. The guilt about Quincy and the long walk did not disappear or even significantly diminish, because guilt was an appropriate response to his failures, regardless of whether those failures resulted from inadequate capability or impossible circumstances, but the guilt became integrated into his identity rather than defining it completely, became one element of his psychological landscape rather than the totality of his emotional experience. He had failed people who depended on him, and that failure would mark him permanently. But the possibility existed that he might succeed in protecting future people who called for help if he committed himself to serving under leadership that possessed capabilities he lacked. Preston's relationship with the sole survivor during this early period was characterized by a kind of hero worship that made him uncomfortable when he recognized it consciously, but felt appropriate given the magnitude of what the survivor had done and what they represented for the possibility of Minutemen resurrection. He studied their decisions and absorbed their tactical approaches, trying to understand what combination of training and character produced someone who consistently chose altruism when selfishness would have been easier and safer. He found himself wanting their approval and feeling disproportionate satisfaction when they praised his contributions or sought his advice on matters where his experience exceeded theirs. This dynamic was psychologically complex because it placed the survivor in a role similar to what Colonel Hollis had occupied in Preston's life. The mentor and father figure whose approval mattered more than survival itself, and whose example provided the standard against which Preston measured his own actions. But Preston was older now than when he joined Hollis's company, had experienced losses and failures that had educated him about human limitations in ways his younger self could not have understood, and his admiration for the sole survivor was tempered by awareness that even exceptional individuals could fail if circumstances overwhelmed their capabilities, or if institutional structures proved inadequate for supporting their custom efforts. The fear that he might lose the sole survivor the way he had lost Hollis haunted Preston's thoughts during quiet moments when his mind was not occupied by immediate tactical concerns or coordination of settlement defenses. He recognized that he was placing too much psychological weight on a single person, that making someone else's presence the foundation for his will to live created vulnerability that the Commonwealth would eventually exploit through its casual cruelty toward anything humans valued. But recognizing this pattern did not give him power to change it, because his trauma had fundamentally altered how he related to leadership and purpose, had made him incapable of self-motivation toward goals that transcended mere survival and required someone else to embody the ideals he would then serve through his supporting role. The weeks following the sole survivor's arrival saw Preston functioning with an effectiveness and engagement that would have seemed impossible during his final days in the Museum of Freedom, when death had seemed not just inevitable but welcome as release from obligations he could not fulfill. He coordinated defense operations across multiple settlements, trained new recruits who were drawn to the Minutemen by reports that the organization was actually protecting people again, and generally performed the administrative and tactical work that allowed the sole survivor to focus on the high-level decisions and personal interventions that only they could provide, given their unique capabilities and authority as general. Preston's role as the right hand to exceptional leadership suited him in ways that formal command never had, allowed him to contribute meaningfully without bearing the psychological weight of being solely responsible for outcomes. He could offer advice and implement decisions and coordinate operations, while the survivor bore ultimate responsibility for strategic direction and the burden of leadership that Preston had found crushing when it fell to him after Hollis's death. This arrangement was comfortable and functional, and probably indicative of psychological damage that prevented him from fully accepting adult responsibility for his own life. But Preston did not examine these implications too closely, because the arrangement worked, and questioning it might undermine the fragile stability he had achieved. The transformation from passively accepting death to actively pursuing life was not complete or permanent, because trauma of the magnitude Preston had experienced does not resolve through single catalytic events or brief periods of positive experience. but the foundation had been laid for psychological recovery that might eventually restore some version of the idealism that had brought him to the Minutemen. Tempered now by understanding of human weakness and institutional fragility, but still operating from conviction that protecting others was work worth dedicating his life to, regardless of the costs and disappointments that effort inevitably produced. Preston Garvey was learning to hope again, carefully, and with awareness that hope made him vulnerable to devastating loss, but hope nonetheless, because the alternative was the living death he had experienced during his final weeks before salvation arrived from the most unexpected source imaginable. The rebuilding of the Minutemen began not with grand declarations or ambitious strategic plans, but with the simple accumulation of small victories that gradually convinced Commonwealth settlements that organized mutual defense might be possible again, that calling for help might actually result in assistance arriving rather than merely adding disappointment to their existing burdens. Ten Pines Bluff was followed by Abernathy Farm, which was followed by Sanctuary Hills, where the original 5 survivors from the Museum of Freedom established their base of operations, and each successful defense created precedent that made the next settlement slightly more willing to trust that the Minutemen's resurrection was genuine rather than merely another false promise from an organization that had thoroughly discredited itself through years of dysfunction and betrayal. Preston found himself occupying a role that felt both familiar and novel, serving as the institutional memory and tactical advisor for a movement that was simultaneously rebuilding something that had existed before and creating something entirely new. He explained to the sole survivor how the Minutemen had operated during their functional years under General Becker, the systems of coordination and mutual support that had made the organization effective when unity existed among its leadership. But he also recognized that simply recreating previous structures would likely reproduce the weaknesses that had allowed the organization to collapse so completely after Becker's death. The new Minutemen needed to learn from past failures while preserving the ideals that had made the organization valuable when it functioned according to its stated principles. The settlements that joined the Minutemen network during these early months represented a cross-section of Commonwealth survival strategies and capabilities, ranging from well-established farms with defensive infrastructure to struggling groups barely maintaining subsistence-level existence. Preston worked with each settlement to assess their defensive needs and available resources, helping them establish security measures that multiplied their effectiveness while minimizing the burden on the central organization's limited supplies and personnel. He taught settlers how to construct proper defensive positions, how to coordinate fire during attacks, how to maintain weapons and equipment that would otherwise degrade into uselessness, transmitting knowledge accumulated through years of Minutemen service to people who had never received formal military training but needed those skills to survive in a commonwealth that would kill them without organization and preparation. The sole survivor's approach to leadership during this rebuilding period differed substantially from what Preston had observed in previous Minutemen commanders, characterized by personal involvement in settlement defense rather than coordinating operations from secure headquarters. The general did not delegate dangerous missions to subordinates while remaining safe themselves, but rather led from the front, personally responding to distress calls and fighting alongside settlers when threats materialized. This approach was tactically inefficient in some ways, requiring the general to spend time on operations that junior Minutemen could have handled. But it created psychological and political effects that more than compensated for the tactical inefficiency by demonstrating to settlements that Minutemen leadership genuinely cared about their welfare rather than viewing them as resources to be exploited. Preston accompanied the sole survivor on many of these early operations, providing tactical advice and supporting fire while observing how someone with pre-war military training approached post-war combat challenges. He learned techniques that had not been part of standard Minutemen training, absorbed strategic thinking that looked beyond immediate tactical problems toward longer-term objectives of building sustainable defensive networks. and generally expanded his own capabilities through exposure to someone whose competence exceeded what the post-war Commonwealth typically produced. The partnership that developed between them was characterized by mutual respect and complementary skills. Preston's intimate knowledge of Commonwealth conditions and Minutemen traditions, combining with the survivors' fresh perspective and superior tactical training to create decision-making that exceeded what either could have achieved independently. The operation to retake the castle represented a turning point in the Minutemen's resurrection, transforming the organization from a scattered network of settlements, receiving occasional assistance, into something approaching a legitimate military force, with headquarters and institutional presence that settlers could recognize and relate to. The castle had been the Minutemen's symbolic and operational center during their period of greatest strength under General Becker, a pre-war fortification whose massive walls and strategic position had made it both practically useful and psychologically important as physical manifestation of the organization's power and permanence. Its loss to Mirelurks during the organizational collapse after Becker's death had symbolized the Minutemen's decline, and its recapture would signal their genuine return as a force worth respecting and supporting. Preston's role during the castle assault demonstrated how far his confidence had recovered from the depths he had experienced during his final days in the Museum of Freedom. His assumption of tactical command during the operation, revealing someone who could function as a leader when circumstances required it, even if he preferred serving in supporting roles. He coordinated the Minutemen forces who established defensive perimeter while he and the sole survivor cleared the walls of Mirelurk presence, his orders crisp and clear and delivered with authority that assumed compliance rather than requesting it. The assault succeeded through combination of superior tactics and the sole survivor's exceptional combat capabilities. Mirelurks driven from fortifications they had occupied for years, and the castle reclaimed for human habitation. The moment when Preston stood on the castle's walls after the Mirelurks were cleared, looking out over Commonwealth territory that the Minutemen could now protect more effectively from this central position, represented perhaps his first experience of genuine pride since Quincy had destroyed his faith in himself and his organization. This was what the Minutemen were supposed to do, what Colonel Hollis had believed they could accomplish if enough good people committed themselves to the cause, and Preston had just helped make it happen despite everything that had suggested such achievement was impossible. The pride was tempered by awareness of how much work remained and how fragile their success might prove if tested by serious opposition, but it existed nonetheless as evidence that his efforts could produce outcomes worth the continued struggle of existence. Radio Freedom's establishment in the castle provided the Minutemen with communication capability that transformed their operational effectiveness while simultaneously announcing their return to any Commonwealth resident with access to a radio receiver. The broadcasts coordinated settlement defenses and called for volunteers to join the organization, but more importantly, they created narrative about what the Minutemen represented and what they were trying to achieve that competed with the years of negative reputation accumulated during the organizational collapse. Preston helped draft the messages that Radio Freedom transmitted, working to articulate the Minutemen's mission and values in language that would resonate with Commonwealth settlers, while avoiding the grandiose claims that previous leadership had made and failed to fulfill. The difference between the Minutemen under the sole survivor's leadership and the organization Preston had joined years earlier became increasingly apparent as the rebuilding progressed and more people affiliated themselves with the renewed movement. The new Minutemen lacked the complex factional politics that had characterized the organization under General Becker, the competing power centers and personality conflicts that had erupted into organizational collapse once Becker's mediating presence was removed. With only one general and a clear command structure that ran through Preston as second in command, There were no seniority disputes or jurisdictional conflicts or debates about resource allocation that had consumed so much energy during the old Minutemen's decline. Preston recognized that this simplified structure was both strength and vulnerability, effective now because the sole survivor was exceptional leader and he was loyal subordinate, but potentially problematic if either of them was killed, or if the organization grew large enough that a single command structure could not effectively coordinate all operations. He thought occasionally about how to build institutional resilience that did not depend entirely on specific individuals, how to create systems that would survive leadership transitions without the catastrophic collapse that had followed Becker's death. But these concerns seemed premature when the organization was still struggling to establish basic operational capability and credibility with Commonwealth settlements. The training of new recruits became one of Preston's primary responsibilities as the organization grew beyond the handful of survivors from the Museum of Freedom into something approaching a genuine military force. He taught them what Colonel Hollis had taught him about the old Minuteman way, the principles of protecting everyone equally and responding to every call for help, and never demanding more from settlements than they could afford to provide. He emphasized that Minutemen authority came from earned trust rather than imposed force, that they served settlements rather than commanding them, that their purpose was enabling Commonwealth communities to defend themselves rather than creating dependency on external protection. Preston's approach to training was shaped by his experiences during both the good years under Hollis and the terrible collapse after Becker's death, his instruction incorporating lessons about what worked and warnings about what had failed so catastrophically. He taught tactical skills with the same thoroughness that had been standard in the old Minutemen, but he also emphasized values and principles with an intensity that suggested he understood that organizational culture mattered more than individual competence for determining whether the movement would survive long term. The recruits who emerged from his training were capable soldiers, but more importantly, they were people who understood what they were fighting for and why the Minutemen's mission mattered beyond mere employment or adventure. Preston's growing confidence during this period manifested not as dramatic personality change, but as gradual reduction in the constant self-doubt and guilt that had characterized his psychological state since Quincy. He still questioned his decisions and worried about failing people who depended on him, still carried the weight of everyone who had died under his inadequate leadership during the long walk. But these burdens no longer dominated his consciousness completely, or prevented him from experiencing satisfaction when operations succeeded. The evidence that he could contribute meaningfully to outcomes that mattered, that his knowledge and skills could help protect people rather than merely delaying their inevitable deaths, slowly rebuilt his sense of competence and worth that trauma had destroyed. The Commonwealth's response to the Minutemen's resurrection was characterized by cautious optimism, mixed with skepticism born from years of watching the organization fail to live up to its promises. Settlements requested assistance with genuine problems, but also tested whether the Minutemen would actually follow through on commitments, whether this new version of the organization would prove more reliable than its predecessor. Preston understood these tests for what they were, and made sure that every commitment was honored and every promise fulfilled. Knowing that the Minutemen's reputation would be built through consistent performance rather than grand declarations about what they intended to accomplish, settlers began approaching Preston directly when they saw him in their communities, expressing gratitude for Minutemen assistance and offering small gifts of food or supplies in appreciation for protection that had allowed them to survive threats they could not have handled independently. These interactions were simultaneously gratifying and uncomfortable for Preston, whose guilt about Quincy made him feel undeserving of praise, while his growing hope about the Minutemen's resurrection made him want to accept that their work mattered and was valued by people they protected. He learned to accept gratitude with appropriate humility while deflecting credit to the sole survivor and the other Minutemen who had contributed to successful operations, maintaining focus on collective achievement rather than individual recognition. Preston's relationship with the sole survivor deepened during this rebuilding period beyond mere professional partnership into something approaching genuine friendship, though the hero worship element never entirely disappeared, because Preston needed someone to believe in, and the survivor continued providing evidence that they deserved that belief through consistent demonstration of competence and commitment to Minutemen ideals. They spent long hours discussing strategy and reviewing operations and planning future expansions of the Minutemen network, conversations that revealed increasingly personal dimensions as trust developed, and Preston felt safe exposing vulnerabilities he normally kept hidden behind his professional demeanor. The survivor learned about Preston's experiences at Quincy, and during the long walk, not through formal debriefing but through fragments shared during quiet moments between operations. Pieces of trauma emerging when something in their current situation triggered memories that Preston had tried to suppress but could not eliminate entirely. The survivor listened without judgment or empty reassurance, offering the kind of steady presence that allowed Preston to acknowledge his pain without being overwhelmed by it. And this emotional support contributed to his healing in ways that exceeded what tactical success alone could have achieved. Preston found himself experiencing something he had not felt since before Quincy, something that might eventually be identified as happiness, if it continued long enough to establish itself as more than temporary respite from suffering. The daily work of coordinating settlement defenses and training recruits and expanding the Minutemen network gave him purpose that transcended mere survival, made his continued existence feel meaningful rather than merely an extended postponement of deserved extinction. He was building something that mattered, contributing to outcomes that made the Commonwealth safer for people who deserved protection, and this sense of constructive purpose gradually filled some of the emptiness that trauma had created in the center of his being. The settlement defense system that emerged during this period, the network of radio communications and coordinated responses that allowed Minutemen to provide rapid assistance when settlements faced threats, became both the organization's greatest strength and the source of Preston's reputation for relentless dedication to responding to every call for help. He established protocols for receiving distress signals and dispatching appropriate forces, created databases of settlement resources and defensive capabilities that allowed for realistic assessment of what assistance different communities needed, and generally built the administrative infrastructure that transformed scattered defensive actions into a coordinated system of mutual protection. Preston's compulsive need to respond to every settlement request, to ensure that no call for help went unanswered, the way Quincy's call had been ignored by other Minutemen companies, created operational patterns that sometimes bordered on obsessive. He monitored radio frequencies constantly, responded immediately to any transmission suggesting a settlement faced danger, and pushed himself and other Minutemen to maintain readiness that allowed rapid deployment regardless of how recently they had completed previous operations. This approach was exhausting and probably unsustainable long-term, but it established the Minutemen's reputation for reliability that was essential for convincing Commonwealth settlements to trust the organization again. The psychological function that this constant activity served for Preston was complex and not entirely healthy. His dedication to helping settlements representing both genuine commitment to Minutemen ideals and compulsive overcompensation for his failures at Quincy. He needed to save people because he had failed to save so many, needed to respond to every call because calls had gone unanswered during the Minutemen's collapse, needed to prove through accumulated successes that his survival served purposes beyond merely adding to the count of people whose protection he had failed. The pattern was therapeutic in some ways and potentially damaging in others, providing purpose, while reinforcing the belief that his worth depended entirely on his usefulness to others, rather than any intrinsic value he possessed as a human being. Success built upon success as the months passed and the Minutemen network expanded throughout the Commonwealth, each defended settlement becoming potential source of new recruits, and each successful operation providing evidence that contradicted the years of negative reputation the organization had accumulated. Preston watched the movement grow with pride, tempered by awareness that growth created new challenges and vulnerabilities, that the larger the organization became, the more difficult maintaining the cultural coherence and values-driven approach that distinguished the new Minutemen from their dysfunctional predecessors. He worked to institutionalize the principles that Colonel Hollis had taught him and that the sole survivor embodied through their actions, trying to create organizational memory that would survive beyond specific individuals and protect against the kind of corruption that had destroyed the previous iteration. The Commonwealth was becoming measurably safer as Minutemen presence expanded and coordinated defense replaced isolated settlement survival strategies. Raiders finding fewer easy targets and super mutants encountering organized resistance that made predation more costly than it had been during the years when the Minutemen's absence left communities vulnerable. Preston could see the effects of their work in settlement, prosperity, and civilian confidence, in children playing outside defensive walls, and traders traveling routes that had been too dangerous during the organizational collapse. These visible improvements validated the Minutemen's mission and justified the costs and sacrifices that rebuilding required, provided evidence that idealism could produce practical results if implemented with competence and consistency. Preston's redemption arc during this period was not complete or perfect because redemption from trauma of the magnitude he had experienced does not proceed linearly from brokenness to wholeness, but rather involves gradual accumulation of positive experiences that slowly outweigh traumatic memories without eliminating them entirely. He still had nightmares about Quincy and the long walk, still experienced moments of crushing doubt about his adequacy as a leader and his worth as a human being, still carried guilt about everyone who had died because his protection was insufficient. But these dark moments were now balanced by evidence that he could succeed when circumstances allowed, that his knowledge and dedication could help protect people rather than merely postponing their deaths, that his survival served purposes beyond accumulating additional failures. The transformation from the broken man who had passively welcomed death in the Museum of Freedom to the functional deputy commander coordinating Commonwealth-wide defensive operations was dramatic enough that Preston occasionally experienced disconnect between his current self and his memories of who he had been during those dark weeks. The psychological distance between those two versions of himself sometimes felt so vast that he struggled to believe they were the same person, that the man who had wanted only to die and the man who now worked relentlessly to build something worth living for could exist within the same consciousness, separated by mere months of time and the catalytic intervention of someone who had given him reason to hope again. Preston Garvey stood watch on the castle's walls during quiet evenings when operations allowed respite from constant activity, looking out over the Commonwealth and seeing not just the dangers and challenges that remained, but also the progress that had been achieved through months of dedicated effort. The Minutemen were returning, settlements were safer, and he had contributed meaningfully to outcomes that validated the ideals Colonel Hollis had died believing in. The satisfaction was profound and complicated, mixed with awareness that success remained fragile and that circumstances could change in ways that destroyed everything they had built. But satisfaction nonetheless, because for the first time since Quincy, he could look at what his efforts had produced and feel something other than crushing guilt about inadequacy. The rebuilding was not finished and perhaps would never be truly complete because the Commonwealth's dangers were permanent features rather than temporary problems that could be solved and forgotten. But the foundation had been laid for something that might endure beyond Preston's lifetime if enough people committed themselves to maintaining it. The Minutemen lived again, not as they had been during their dysfunctional final years under fractured leadership, but as something new that learned from past failures, while preserving the ideals that had always made the organization worth fighting for. Preston had survived to see this resurrection and had contributed to making it possible, and that contribution gave his continued existence, meaning that trauma had tried to destroy, but had ultimately failed to eliminate completely. Preston Garvey's core philosophy about the world and humanity's place within it was shaped less by abstract theoretical contemplation than by visceral experiences that demonstrated with brutal clarity what happened when people abandoned principles in favor of expedient self-interest. The collapse of the Minutemen had not been merely organizational failure, but moral catastrophe, proof that institutions claiming to protect the vulnerable could transform into vehicles for exploitation when leadership prioritized personal power over collective mission. This knowledge informed Preston's approach to every faction and individual he encountered in the Commonwealth. His judgments, based not on rhetoric or stated intentions, but on observed actions and their effects on people who lacked power to protect themselves from those who possessed it. The philosophical foundation underlying Preston's worldview was deceptively simple, built on conviction that freedom represented the highest value worth fighting for, and that freedom required both negative liberty from coercion and positive capacity to live without constant terror of violence or starvation. He believed that civilization was not merely the presence of buildings and technology, but the social arrangements that allowed people to pursue their own visions of good life without imposing those visions on others through force, and that the Commonwealth's current state represented failure of civilization rather than its absence. The world before the bombs had possessed civilization's infrastructure without its moral foundation, had built cities and governments that ultimately chose mutual annihilation over negotiated coexistence. And the post-war Commonwealth was building toward either genuine civilization that learned from those failures or repetition of the same catastrophic mistakes that had destroyed the previous world. Preston's view of the Brotherhood of Steel was complicated by his respect for their military discipline and effectiveness, combined with deep concern about their authoritarian tendencies and assumption that their technological superiority gave them legitimate authority over Commonwealth affairs. He had fought alongside Brotherhood soldiers during operations where their interests aligned with Minutemen protection of settlements, had witnessed their competence in combat against super mutants and other major threats that exceeded what most Commonwealth forces could handle independently. The Brotherhood represented organized military power deployed against genuine dangers, and Preston could appreciate their contributions to making the region safer, even while questioning whether their methods and motivations aligned with his understanding of what the Commonwealth needed for sustainable peace. The fundamental tension in Preston's assessment of the Brotherhood centered on the question of who the Commonwealth belonged to and who possessed legitimate authority to make decisions affecting its people. The Brotherhood arrived from outside with superior technology and military capability, claiming authority based on their mission to preserve pre-war knowledge and protect humanity from dangerous technologies. But Preston understood that authority claimed through superior force was functionally indistinguishable from tyranny, regardless of how noble the claimed motivations. His reminder to Paladin Dance that the Commonwealth belonged to all of its people, rather than to any external faction, represented Preston's core belief that legitimate authority emerged from consent of those governed, rather than from capacity to impose order through overwhelming military power. Preston's willingness to work with the Brotherhood on specific operations, while maintaining philosophical opposition to their broader agenda, demonstrated the kind of pragmatic idealism that characterized his approach to complex political situations. He understood that the Commonwealth faced threats requiring coordinated response from multiple capable factions, that defeating the Institute or containing super mutant populations or addressing other existential dangers might require temporary alliances with groups whose long-term objectives conflicted with Minutemen principles. But cooperation on specific operations did not require endorsement of the Brotherhood's assumption that they possessed inherent right to govern or regulate Commonwealth affairs, and Preston was careful to maintain distinction between tactical alliance and strategic subordination. The concern that the Brotherhood might eventually impose rather than protect, might use their military superiority to establish authoritarian control over settlements that needed protection but not domination, informed Preston's cautious approach to their presence in the region. He had witnessed how quickly organizations claiming protective missions could transform into exploitative forces when institutional culture prioritized the organization's interests over those of the people it claimed to serve. had seen the Minutemen themselves descend into exactly this corruption during their collapse after Becker's death. The Brotherhood's discipline and clear chain of command prevented the kind of factional infighting that had destroyed the Minutemen, but it also created conditions where abuses of power could be systematically implemented rather than merely emerging from organizational chaos. Preston's relationship with the railroad was characterized by sympathy for their cause, combined with frustration at what he viewed as excessively narrow focus that diverted resources and attention from broader threats facing Commonwealth communities. He understood the moral imperative of liberating synths from institute slavery, recognized that synthetic persons possessed consciousness and capacity for suffering that created obligations toward them, identical to obligations toward biological humans. His interactions with synth companions like Nick Valentine and Curie were marked by complete absence of prejudice based on their artificial origins. His treatment of them as equals reflecting his belief that personhood derived from consciousness and capacity for moral reasoning rather than from biological substrate. The railroad's dedication to liberating synths demonstrated admirable commitment to principle despite overwhelming odds and constant danger from institute forces that viewed escaped synths as property requiring reclamation. Preston respected their willingness to risk everything for cause they believed in, recognized the courage required to maintain underground resistance against enemy possessing technological superiority and unlimited resources for hunting those who opposed them. But his respect for their dedication was tempered by frustration that their focus on synth liberation consumed resources and capabilities that could address broader threats affecting far more people throughout the Commonwealth. Preston's challenge to Deacon about fighting for cause bigger than handful of people, rather than for entire Commonwealth, represented his fundamental disagreement with the railroad's strategic priorities. His conviction that moral obligation extended to all conscious beings, rather than to particular groups whose suffering happened to align with specific ideological commitments. The railroad was fighting for freedom of synths while the Commonwealth's human settlers faced raiders and super mutants and starvation and disease. Threats that killed far more people than the Institute's synth retention programs, but received less attention from people who could make meaningful difference if they expanded their moral horizon beyond their chosen cause. Preston's treatment of synths as equals, without requiring special advocacy organizations to defend their rights, demonstrated his belief that genuine equality meant judging individuals by their actions and character rather than by their origins or affiliations. Nick Valentine was a good person who deserved respect and protection because of how he treated others and what he contributed to making the Commonwealth better, not because of any abstract theoretical commitment to synth rights or opposition to institute policies. Curie's transformation from robot to synth body did not change Preston's fundamental assessment of her worth or his willingness to fight alongside her, because his evaluation of people never depended primarily on biological versus synthetic composition. The principled foundation for Preston's egalitarian treatment of synths derived from his understanding that consciousness and capacity for suffering created moral obligations, regardless of the specific mechanisms producing that consciousness. He had watched too many humans prove themselves unworthy of respect through their choices to believe that biological humanity automatically conferred superior moral status, had seen synthetic persons demonstrate greater commitment to protecting others than most biological humans managed. The distinction that mattered was between those who built versus those who destroyed, between those who protected versus those who preyed. And that distinction cut across the biological-synthetic divide rather than aligning with it. Preston's absolute opposition to the Institute reflected his conviction that they represented everything the Minutemen existed to oppose. An organization that terrorized Commonwealth settlements for purposes ranging from scientific experimentation to resource extraction to simple demonstration of power. The Institute possessed technological capabilities that could have made the Commonwealth dramatically safer and more prosperous if deployed for constructive purposes. but they chose instead to use those capabilities for advancing their own interests while treating surface dwellers as experimental subjects or obstacles to be removed. Their sabotage of the Commonwealth Provisional Government, their kidnapping and replacement of surface dwellers with synth infiltrators, their casual murder of anyone who interfered with their operations, all demonstrated that they viewed Commonwealth people as resources to exploit rather than as fellow humans deserving consideration. The CPG's failure was particularly significant for Preston's assessment of the Institute because it demonstrated that Commonwealth people could create functional governmental structures despite the harsh conditions and resource scarcity that made cooperation difficult. The provisional government had experienced infighting and disagreements about priorities and resource allocation, but these conflicts represented healthy features of free society where multiple perspectives competed through argument rather than violence. Preston's insistence that quarrels and disagreements proved freedom existed rather than undermining it reflected his understanding that unanimous agreement typically indicated either genuine consensus or suppressed dissent, and that free societies necessarily included conflict between different visions of how to organize collective life. The Institute's systematic elimination of CPG delegates transformed political disagreements that could have been resolved through negotiation and compromise into permanent removal of the possibility that Commonwealth settlements might organize themselves into functional government independent of Institute control or influence. This action revealed the Institute's fundamental hostility towards surface autonomy, their conviction that they possessed superior understanding of how the Commonwealth should be governed, and that surface dwellers lacked capacity to make their own decisions about political organization. Preston understood this kind of paternalistic authoritarianism as perhaps more dangerous than straightforward tyranny because it claimed to serve the interests of those it dominated while denying them any voice in determining what their interests actually were. Preston's inability to compromise on raiders represented the clearest expression of his conviction that some moral lines could not be crossed regardless of circumstances or claimed justifications, that certain activities placed people outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior and made them legitimate targets for elimination rather than reformation. Raiders chose to prey on Commonwealth settlements rather than contributing to productive activity, chose to destroy and steal rather than build and trade, chose to terrorize and murder rather than protect and defend. These choices revealed character so fundamentally opposed to civilized values that no amount of desperation or difficult circumstances could excuse or justify their actions. The philosophical foundation for Preston's uncompromising opposition to raiders derived from his understanding that civilization required distinguishing between acceptable and unacceptable responses to scarcity and danger, that not all survival strategies were morally equivalent, even when all emerged from legitimate needs for food and shelter and safety. The Commonwealth was harsh, and resources were scarce, and survival was difficult for everyone. But most people responded to these conditions by farming, or trading, or providing services rather than by robbing and murdering their neighbors. Raiders represented conscious choice to reject cooperative survival strategies in favor of predatory ones, and that choice made them enemies of everyone attempting to build rather than destroy. Preston's response to the sole survivor becoming overboss of Nuka World raiders demonstrated how completely his moral opposition to raiding transcended personal relationships or tactical considerations, how his principles operated as genuine constraints on behavior rather than as flexible guidelines that could be abandoned when inconvenient. The betrayal he experienced when the survivor allied with raiders was not merely disappointment at poor strategic decision, but fundamental questioning of everything he thought he knew about the person he had believed embodied Minutemen. Ideals most perfectly. The possibility that someone could fight to protect Commonwealth settlements and then turn around and lead raids against those same settlements suggested either that Preston had been completely wrong about the survivor's character, that even people who seemed genuinely committed to protecting others could be corrupted by circumstances or opportunities for power. The distinction between encountering the survivor as overboss before versus after, establishing them as Minutemen General, mattered because it determined whether Preston experienced betrayal of established trust or merely encountered someone whose values were revealed as incompatible with cooperation. Meeting an overboss for the first time allowed Preston to simply refuse association with someone whose choices marked them as enemy of everything the Minutemen represented, maintaining his principles without experiencing personal devastation at betrayal by someone he had believed in. But discovering that the general he had served loyally and believed in completely had become overboss after accepting Minutemen command created psychological crisis that exceeded even Quincy's impact, because it suggested that Preston's judgment about who deserved trust and faith was fundamentally flawed. The fact that Preston could not forgive the survivor's choice to lead raiders, even if they subsequently destroyed those raiders and attempted to return to Minutemen service, revealed how completely the betrayal had damaged something essential in Preston's capacity for trust. Quincy had taught him that organizations could fail and brothers in arms could betray each other, but he had maintained faith that individuals who genuinely embodied protective ideals existed and could be identified through their consistent actions over time. The survivor had been proof that such people existed, that Preston's faith in human goodness was not naive delusion but accurate recognition of real moral qualities that some individuals possessed. Learning that even this person could choose to lead raiders against Commonwealth settlements destroyed Preston's confidence in his ability to identify who deserved trust, suggested that perhaps no one could be relied upon to consistently prioritize protecting others over personal advantage. Preston's statement that their friendship was over and that he could never trust the survivor again romantically, but would follow orders as loyal. Minuteman reflected the tragedy of someone whose trauma had taught them that personal relationships created vulnerabilities that inevitably led to devastating loss. He could maintain professional relationship with someone who had betrayed him because professional relationships required only competent performance of duties rather than emotional investment or personal trust. But he could not allow himself to care about someone who had proven themselves capable of choosing raiding over protection. The distinction between following orders and trusting the person giving those orders represented Preston's attempt to protect himself from experiencing again the kind of betrayal that had nearly destroyed him at Quincy. His recognition that he could not survive another loss of that magnitude if he allowed himself to become emotionally invested in someone who might abandon the principles he needed them to embody. The binary quality of Preston's moral thinking about raiders and other fundamental questions reflected both the clarity that trauma had created about what mattered and the inflexibility that came from needing absolute certainty, world that offered only ambiguity and complexity. He understood intellectually that most human behavior existed in gray areas, where competing goods and unavoidable trade-offs made simple moral judgments inadequate. But his emotional need for clear right and wrong exceeded what intellectual understanding could moderate. The chaos at Quincy had resulted partly from inability to distinguish between legitimate disagreements and betrayals deserving condemnation, from organizational culture that treated all conflicts as equivalent, rather than recognizing that some disputes involve principles that could not be compromised. Preston had absorbed from that experience the lesson that moral clarity prevented the kind of decay that had destroyed the Minutemen, even if that clarity sometimes produced inflexibility that created its own problems. Preston's self-awareness about his limitations as diplomat or politician represented understanding that his strengths and weaknesses were two sides of same coin, that the unwavering commitment to principles that made him reliable also made him unsuitable for situations requiring flexibility and compromise. He recognized that effective leadership sometimes required accepting imperfect outcomes and making deals with problematic allies and prioritizing strategic victories over moral purity, But he also knew that he personally lacked capacity to make those kinds of calculations without feeling that he was betraying everything Colonel Hollis had taught him about what Minutemen should be. His acceptance of supporting role under the sole survivor's leadership reflected not just humility about his capabilities, but accurate assessment that the Commonwealth needed both people who could navigate political complexity and people who maintained uncompromising commitment to core principles, and that he was better suited for the latter role than the former. The cost of Preston's idealism was isolation from people who prioritized pragmatic effectiveness over principled consistency. The sense that his refusal to compromise on fundamental questions made him difficult to work with or relate to on personal level. Other companions found him one-dimensional or overly serious, too focused on duty and mission to engage in the kind of casual conversation or playful banter that characterized healthy relationships between people who spent time together. Preston was aware of this perception and understood its accuracy, recognized that his trauma had narrowed his emotional range and his personality in ways that made him less fully human than he had been before Quincy taught him, that caring about things beyond immediate duty created vulnerabilities he could not afford. But Preston also understood that the world needed people like him precisely because most people were more flexible and pragmatic, more willing to compromise principles for strategic advantage or personal benefit. Someone had to maintain unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable, even when protection was difficult or dangerous or politically inconvenient, had to refuse the accommodations and moral compromises that made life easier but civilization impossible. Preston had chosen or been chosen by circumstances to be that person, the one who said no to raiders and yes to every settlement needing help, the one whose consistency and reliability came from inability to be otherwise rather than from superhuman virtue. Preston's growing feelings for the sole survivor developed gradually through months of working together and fighting alongside each other and building the Minutemen network into something approaching the dream that had drawn Preston to the organization years earlier. The admiration he felt for the survivors' competence and commitment to protecting others slowly transformed into something more personal and vulnerable, an emotional attachment that went beyond professional respect or hero worship to include the kind of desire for intimate connection that Preston had not allowed himself to feel since before Quincy taught him that caring about people created opportunities for devastating loss. The feelings were characterized primarily by admiration rather than physical attraction, or the kind of passionate desire that typically drives romantic relationships. Preston's orientation toward the survivor, based on witnessing them consistently embody the qualities he valued most highly, rather than responding to their physical presence or personal quirks. He loved them for being selfless when selfishness would have been easier, for risking their life to protect strangers when they could have focused on their personal quest to find their kidnapped child, for choosing to rebuild the Minutemen when they could have joined more powerful factions, offering greater resources and status. These were the qualities that mattered to Preston because they were the qualities he believed essential for anyone worth loving, and the survivor possessed them in abundance that seemed almost impossible given the Commonwealth's typical effects on character development. Preston's inability to express these feelings first reflected the self-consciousness and sense of unworthiness that trauma had embedded in his understanding of himself and his relationships with others. He viewed himself as fundamentally damaged by his failures at Quincy and during the long walk, marked by inadequacy that made him unsuitable as romantic partner for someone as exceptional as the sole survivor. The general was hero who had saved the Commonwealth and rebuilt the Minutemen, and consistently demonstrated capabilities that exceeded what most people could achieve, while Preston was merely someone who had survived through luck rather than virtue, and who contributed to the survivor's success only through supporting role that anyone with comparable training could have filled. The assumption that the survivor remained emotionally attached to their pre-war spouse despite 2 centuries of cryogenic suspension and the spouse's murder by Institute operatives provided Preston with additional rationalization. for not expressing feelings that he feared would be rejected. He understood that grief did not follow predictable timelines or respect logical arguments about moving on, that the survivor might need years or decades to process their loss before becoming emotionally available for new romantic relationships. Preston's own experience with grief and loss made him sympathetic to this possibility, while also providing excuse for not risking rejection that would confirm his belief that he was unworthy of someone as exceptional as the person he had come to love. The conversation that occurred if the sole survivor initiated romantic relationship by asking Preston about his feelings revealed depths of vulnerability and hope that Preston normally kept carefully hidden behind his professional demeanor and unwavering focus on Minutemen mission. His shock at learning that the survivor felt the same way about him, that his feelings were reciprocated rather than representing one-sided attraction that would never be fulfilled, suggested that he had genuinely not imagined this possibility, despite months of working closely together and developing the kind of intimate knowledge that came from shared danger and mutual trust. The disbelief in his voice when he confirmed that the survivor was asking about romantic feelings rather than some other kind of relationship reflected how completely his self-assessment included assumption that he was unsuitable as romantic partner for anyone, let alone for someone he admired as much as the general. Preston's statement that the feeling was real rather than just in his imagination carried weight that transcended the specific romantic context, suggesting that he had questioned whether his emotions were genuine responses to actual person or merely projections of his need for someone to believe in and follow. The validation that came from having feelings recognized and reciprocated mattered not just romantically, but also as confirmation that his perceptions of reality were accurate, that the connection he felt was not delusion born from trauma and desperate need for hope, but genuine relationship based on mutual understanding and appreciation. This validation was perhaps more important to Preston than the romantic relationship itself, because it suggested that his judgment about people and situations could be trusted despite Quincy's lessons about how completely he could misunderstand the character of those he believed in. The nature of Preston's love for the sole survivor was characterized by admiration and respect rather than passion or physical desire, his romantic feelings emerging from intellectual and moral appreciation rather than from the kind of animal attraction that drives most romantic relationships. He loved them for who they were and what they represented, rather than for how they made him feel or the pleasure their presence provided, and this foundation created relationship that was simultaneously more stable and less intensely emotional than typical romantic partnerships. Preston's love was the kind that could survive absence and difficulty, and even serious disagreement about tactics or priorities, but it was also love that might not sustain itself if the survivor stopped embodying the qualities that made Preston admire them in the first place. The conditionality of Preston's romantic attachment, the sense that his love depended on the survivor continuing to be the kind of person who deserved admiration, created vulnerability that became obvious when considering hypothetical scenarios where the survivor stopped being general or abandoned Minutemen service to pursue other objectives. Preston's love was not for a person, independent of their choices and commitments, but rather for the person as general, the individual who had chosen to rebuild the Minutemen and protect the Commonwealth. And it was unclear whether that love would survive if its foundation was removed by the survivor, choosing differently about how to spend their time and energy. This quality made Preston's love admirable in its way, but also somewhat cold or impersonal, lacking the unconditional acceptance and desire for another person's well-being, independent of their usefulness or alignment with one's values that characterized the deepest forms of romantic love. Preston would stand by the survivor through difficulties and challenges related to Minutemen service, would support them through failures and setbacks, and even serious mistakes, as long as those mistakes did not involve fundamental betrayal of protective principles. But it was questionable whether he could love someone who chose to stop being general and focus on personal interests rather than collective welfare. whether his romantic attachment could survive the kind of normal human self-interest that most people exhibited and most romantic partners accepted as natural part of relationships. Preston's awkwardness with physical intimacy and expressions of affection reflected both his personal discomfort with vulnerability and his general orientation toward duty and mission that made personal pleasures feel somehow inappropriate or selfish. His resistance to hugging and his tendency to return quickly to business after moments of personal connection suggested someone whose emotional range had been narrowed by trauma to focus almost entirely on protective responsibilities at expense of other aspects of human experience. He understood intellectually that romantic relationships typically involved physical affection and personal attention that went beyond what professional partnerships required. But his comfort zone remained firmly in the professional realm, where he knew what was expected and how to perform competently. The incongruity of Preston using terms of endearment like babe while maintaining his serious, duty-focused demeanor created almost comical contrast that highlighted how little he understood about romantic relationships or how to express intimate feelings in ways that most people would recognize as genuinely romantic. The word came from his attempt to conform to what he thought romantic partners were supposed to say to each other, rather than from natural expression of how he actually felt. And its delivery, in Preston's characteristically formal tone, stripped it of whatever warmth or intimacy it might have carried if spoken by someone more comfortable with casual affection. Preston's limitations as romantic partner were not failures of character or commitment, but rather natural consequences of trauma that had fundamentally altered his capacity for the kind of emotional availability and personal focus that healthy, romantic relationships typically required. He was too wrapped up in Minutemen mission and too focused on protecting Commonwealth settlements to devote the kind of attention to personal relationship that would have made him genuinely satisfying romantic partner for most people. The sole survivor might appreciate his unwavering loyalty and his genuine, if awkwardly expressed affection, but they would also need to accept that Preston's emotional energy was primarily devoted to causes rather than people, that his love would always be conditional on their continued alignment with values he considered non-negotiable. The comparison between Preston's appeal as romantic partner and companions like Hancock or Kate highlighted how his exceptional moral character did not translate into exceptional romantic desirability, how being admirable was different from being attractive or interesting or fun to spend time with in contexts unrelated to fighting and protecting settlements. Hancock possessed charisma and worldly experience and playful personality that made him entertaining companion even when no immediate crisis required attention, while Kate combined vulnerability and strength in ways that created emotional depth and complexity beyond what Preston's one-dimensional focus on duty allowed. Preston commanded respect and gratitude for his selfless service to Commonwealth welfare, but most people would prefer having drinks with Hancock or exploring personal connection with Kate because those relationships offered dimensions of human experience that Preston's trauma had foreclosed. Preston's awareness of his own limitations as romantic partner, his understanding that friendship might be more appropriate than romance, given his inability to be the kind of attentive and emotionally present partner that most people needed, informed his response if the sole survivor rejected his romantic interest. He accepted rejection with grace that suggested he had expected it, or at least considered it, likely given his accurate assessment of what he could offer romantically compared to what most people wanted from intimate relationships. The rejection confirmed what he already believed about his unworthiness, but did so in a way that allowed him to maintain professional relationship and continue serving as loyal Minuteman, because that role never depended on personal reciprocation of feelings he struggled to express adequately. But Preston's self-deprecation about his romantic limitations should not obscure the genuine qualities he possessed that made him worthy of love, even if those qualities did not align with typical romantic preferences. His unwavering loyalty and absolute reliability and consistent demonstration of values that transcended self-interest represented character strengths that were rare in the Commonwealth or anywhere else, qualities that some people would value more highly than the charisma or passion or emotional availability that made other companions more obviously attractive as romantic partners. Someone who valued principled consistency and genuine selflessness above personal chemistry might find in Preston exactly the kind of partner they needed, even if that person would be minority among potential romantic partners who prioritized other qualities. Preston's reputation throughout the Commonwealth grew steadily as the Minutemen's resurrection progressed and more settlements benefited from their protection, his name becoming associated with reliability and genuine commitment to helping others in ways that made him stand out even among other Minutemen. Settlers recognized him on sight when he visited their communities, approached with gratitude and respect that suggested his reputation had preceded him. Through trader networks and radio broadcasts that spread information about who was actually protecting the Commonwealth from threats that had been growing bolder during the years when the Minutemen existed only as failed memory. The specific quality of Preston's fame derived from perception that he embodied the Minutemen ideals in their purest form, that he represented what the organization was supposed to be, rather than what it had become during its dysfunctional final years. People understood that Preston genuinely cared about their welfare, rather than viewing them as resources to exploit or problems to manage, that he showed up when called and followed through on commitments, and never demanded more than settlements could afford to provide. This reputation for authentic selflessness distinguished him from other faction representatives who might be equally effective militarily, but whose motivations included advancement of organizational interests or personal gain alongside whatever genuine concern they felt for Commonwealth welfare. Settlers' interactions with Preston in their communities revealed the respect and affection that his reputation had earned. Their gifts of food and supplies, offered not as payment for services rendered, but as expressions of gratitude to someone who had made their lives measurably better through his dedication and competence. Preston's responses to these gestures were characteristically modest, his deflection of praise toward the sole survivor and other Minutemen reflecting genuine discomfort with being singled out for recognition when he viewed his work as merely doing what any decent person would do if they possessed his training and capabilities. The discomfort revealed how completely Preston's sense of identity centered on duty rather than recognition, how little he needed external validation when his internal standards for performance remained far higher than what others expected from him. Other characters throughout the Commonwealth commented on Preston's reputation with the kind of specific knowledge that suggested his name and activities were topics of conversation among people who cared about regional security and who was actually working to improve conditions versus merely claiming to do so. The observation that he had taken over Hollis's group after the Quincy massacre and was one of the good ones reflected understanding of both Preston's history and his character. Recognition that he had survived catastrophe that would have broken most people and had somehow maintained commitment to ideals despite overwhelming evidence that those ideals could not prevent tragedy or guarantee success. The imposter incident, where someone attempted to steal Preston's identity, revealed how valuable his reputation had become, that claiming to be Preston Garvey carried sufficient credibility to make the impersonation worth attempting. The fact that someone would try to appropriate his name suggested that Preston had become recognizable enough throughout the Commonwealth that his identity could be exploited for material gain or social capital, that settlers trusted Preston Garvey sufficiently to provide resources or cooperation that they would not offer to unknown Minutemen. This recognition was simultaneously validation of Preston's successful rehabilitation of the Minutemen reputation and source of concern about how his personal identity had become entangled with the organization in ways that made him vulnerable to exploitation or created unrealistic expectations about what any individual could accomplish. Preston's role as the public face of the Minutemen's resurrection placed him in position where his personal behavior and choices reflected on the organization as a whole, where his failures would damage not just his own reputation, but the broader movement's credibility, with settlements that needed to trust the Minutemen would consistently perform as promised. This responsibility added weight to decisions that would have been merely personal if he were not carrying the symbolic burden of representing an entire organization, made him more cautious about risks and more careful about maintaining standards, because he understood that people were watching and evaluating whether the new Minutemen would be different from their dysfunctional predecessors. The gap between Preston's public reputation as hero and reliable protector and his private understanding of himself as fundamentally damaged person barely maintaining functionality through dedication to duty created psychological tension that he rarely allowed others to see. Publicly, he projected confidence and capability because settlers needed to believe someone competent was protecting them. But privately, he continued struggling with guilt about Quincy and self-doubt about his adequacy as leader and general awareness that his mental health remained fragile despite months of successful operations. The disconnect between how others saw him and how he saw himself was sometimes dizzying in its magnitude, the praise and recognition feeling like mistaken attribution to someone who did not deserve credit for merely doing what circumstances forced him to do. Preston's discomfort with being celebrated revealed core humility that transcended false modesty or performative self-deprecation, genuine belief that his actions did not merit the kind of recognition settlers offered because he was simply trying to partially compensate for his failures rather than accomplishing anything particularly heroic. The fact that settlers viewed his consistent reliability as exceptional rather than as baseline expectation for anyone claiming to protect others suggested to Preston how low standards had fallen during the Minutemen's collapse, how completely people had adjusted expectations downward to accommodate organizational dysfunction. He was being praised for meeting standards that should have been minimum requirement for anyone wearing Minuteman uniform, and the praise felt more like indictment of how far the organization had fallen than like genuine recognition of exceptional achievement. The legend that was forming around Preston Garvey throughout the Commonwealth bore only partial resemblance to the complicated, damaged person who actually existed beneath the reputation and the uniform and the consistent demonstration of reliable service. The legend emphasized his heroic qualities and his unwavering commitment and his role in rebuilding an organization that protected the vulnerable, but it could not capture the nightmares that still disrupted his sleep, or the constant self-doubt that questioned every decision, or the way he used duty as substitute for genuine emotional healing. Preston understood that legends served social functions beyond accurate representation of individuals, that people needed heroes to believe in more than they needed complete psychological portraits of flawed humans doing their best under impossible circumstances. The responsibility of being legend, while knowing yourself to be merely human-created burden that Preston added to all his other burdens. Weight of maintaining performance that matched expectations, while accepting that he would inevitably disappoint those expectations when his limitations became obvious through failure he could not prevent. He had experienced this pattern before, during the good years with Colonel Hollis, when the Minutemen's success created expectations that organizational dysfunction eventually betrayed, and he feared repeating that cycle now, when so many people had invested hope in the Minutemen's resurrection. The difference was that now he understood the fragility of success and the inevitability of setbacks, approached fame with wariness, born from experience, with how quickly reputation could transform from asset to liability when circumstances changed. Preston Garvey walked through Commonwealth settlements, carrying the weight of being symbol as well as person, representing ideals that transcended his individual existence, while also being vulnerable human who could fail or die, or simply prove inadequate for responsibilities that circumstances and his own choices had placed upon him. The legend would outlive the man, if the Minutemen survived long enough to establish themselves as permanent fixture of Commonwealth security, would be simplified and idealized by people who needed heroes more than they needed accurate historical records. But in the present moment, Preston remained simultaneously both the legend and the man, carrying reputation he did not feel he deserved, while trying to fulfill duties that exceeded what any single person could sustain indefinitely. The Commonwealth needed Preston Garvey, or at least needed what he represented, proof that selfless service was possible, even in a world that punished selflessness and rewarded exploitation. His existence provided evidence that contradicted cynical assumptions about human nature that the post-war environment seemed designed to confirm, suggested that idealism could survive contact with brutal reality if individual possessed sufficient strength and found sufficient support from people who shared his values. Whether Preston personally felt worthy of his reputation mattered less than whether that reputation inspired others to join the Minutemen or support settlement defense, or simply believe that the Commonwealth could become better through organized effort rather than remaining forever trapped in cycles of violence and exploitation. Preston's legacy was being written through his daily actions and the organization he was helping rebuild, and the countless individual lives he had saved or improved through protection that might not have existed without his dedication and competence. That legacy would be his redemption, if redemption was possible for someone who carried Quincy's weight, would justify his survival, if survival needed justification beyond simple fact of continuing to draw breath. He was becoming legend not through seeking fame, but through consistently embodying values he believed in, despite knowing from experience how completely those values could fail to protect people who deserved protection. The legend of Preston Garvey was simultaneously burden and blessing, weight that made his continued existence more difficult and meaning that made it worthwhile. And so, we reach the end of Preston Garvey's story. Though of course, his story never truly ends, as long as settlements need defending, and the Commonwealth requires someone willing to stand between the innocent and those who would harm them. We have walked beside him from idealistic boy to broken survivor to reluctant legend, witnessing every transformation that shaped the man who would become the Minutemen's truest embodiment, even when the organization itself had failed and betrayed everything it claimed to represent. Preston Garvey represents something the world desperately needs but rarely produces. Proof that genuine goodness can survive even the most brutal attempts to destroy it. That idealism, tempered by tragedy, becomes not cynicism, but wisdom that understands the cost of principles while refusing to abandon them. The Commonwealth needs fewer Hancocks with their easy charm, and more Preston Garveys with their uncomfortable insistence that protecting others matters more than personal comfort or safety. That duty transcends convenience, and that someone must keep watch even when watching means bearing unbearable weight. Rest now, knowing that while you sleep the watch continues, that Preston Garvey stands vigilant over settlements that called for help and received it because one man refused to let Quincy's lessons destroy his capacity for hope. Another settlement needs your help, yes, but that call is not burden but purpose, not annoyance but salvation. The reason Preston Garvey chooses life over death and duty over despair each morning when he wakes to face another day of impossible responsibilities, carried by someone who believes impossibility is merely difficulty that requires greater effort. Sweet dreams, wanderer. The Minutemen stand watch still, and Preston Garvey keeps faith with ideals that the world tried to kill but could not quite extinguish. Let his vigil be your comfort, his dedication, your shield against the darkness, his unwavering commitment, your reminder that goodness exists, even in worlds designed to crush it. The Commonwealth sleeps safer because one sincere soul refused to surrender hope when surrender would have been so much easier than continuing to believe.